Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The copper vein. The sound arrived before the silence, a wet, muscular snap like the cracking of a massive tendon against oak, followed by the sudden, absolute death of the radio. One moment, the cabin was filled with the droning static of the NOAA weather band, the tinny voice of a dispatcher in Duluth reading off barometric pressures and wind speeds for the Keweenaw Peninsula. And the next, there was nothing but the hollow click of dead circuitry and the groaning protest of the old barge's hull as something vast and unseen brushed against it in the black water below. Dr. Aris Thorne didn't look up from his microscope. He was hunched over a portable examination table, his narrow shoulders blocking the swinging oil lamp that cast their makeshift laboratory in shades of trembling amber and shadow, and his gloved fingers were pinching a pair of ceramic tweezers with the kind of delicate precision that suggested he was handling something far more precious than mere metal. The copper sample sat on a glass slide between him and the microscope's eyepiece, a jagged cylinder of ore no thicker than a child's finger, and it was vibrating. Not the gentle shimmer of a tuning fork struck by a careless hand, but a violent, teeth-chattering oscillation that made the glass beneath it rattle against the steel table like a dying insect. Thorne stared at it, his pale blue eyes narrowing behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and he felt the first cold thread of something that might have been apprehension crawl up his spine, though he would have sooner swallowed the sample whole than admitted to such a primitive sensation. He was a man who viewed mythology as marketing for the ignorant, a branding exercise for cultures too backward to understand geology, and he had come to this remote, fog-shrouded outpost on the shores of Lake Superior with the singular, arrogant purpose of proving that the legends of the Mishipeshu were nothing more than fairy tales concocted by indigenous peoples to keep greedy corporations away from the richest underwater copper veins in North America. He was here for Ethelgard Mining, a corporation so obsessed with the concept of pure source, copper, that they had funded this entire expedition, based on satellite imaging and geological surveys, that suggested a massive, untouched deposit lying in the treacherous underwater trenches just off the coast of the Keweenaw, and he had assembled a team of 4 other specialists who shared his disdain for superstition and his hunger for academic recognition. The team had been dropped off 3 weeks prior by a battered supply barge that had deposited them on a rocky spit of land with their drilling equipment, their prefabricated cabin modules, and enough freeze-dried rations to last 2 months. The outpost was a skeletal arrangement of aluminum and plywood perched on the edge of a cliff that dropped 20 feet into water the color of old motor oil, water that seemed to drink the light and give back nothing but a menacing, glassy stillness. The local Ojibwe guides who had piloted the supply boat had refused to stay overnight. They had unloaded the gear with hurried, whispered efficiency, their dark eyes darting toward the water every few seconds as if expecting something to surface. And when Thorne had pressed them for information about the so-called underwater panther, the supposed guardian spirit of the deep copper veins, the eldest of the men had simply shaken his head and said, in heavily accented English, that the lake did not like its bones being touched. Thorne had laughed at that, a sharp, barking sound that had echoed off the cliff face and died without resonance, and he had waved them off with the casual dismissal of a man who believed himself above the irrational fears of the uneducated. He had not thought about the guide's words again until the night the copper started to sing. The sample on the table was the first major core they had extracted from the primary vein, pulled up from a depth of 400 feet by the powerful diamond bit drill that dominated the center of their barge platform. The extraction had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly, the drill boring through sediment and rock with an ease that had made the team's geotechnical engineer, a burly man named Marcus Webb, remark that it felt like the earth was helping them, opening up like a willing mouth. The core had emerged in a perfect cylinder, gleaming with an unnatural iridescence that caught the light and fractured it into colors that had no business existing in raw copper ore. It was not the dull, oxidized red-brown of typical lake copper, nor the bright, conductivity orange of refined wire, but something else entirely, a shimmering, almost bioluminescent quality that seemed to pulse from within the metal itself, as if the copper were not merely a mineral but a living, breathing thing. Thorn had been ecstatic. He had immediately declared it a new subtype of native copper, perhaps formed under unique tectonic pressures that created a crystalline lattice capable of refracting light in unprecedented ways, and he had ordered the team to continue drilling deeper, to widen the borehole, to bring up as much of the miraculous material as the equipment could handle. They had worked through the night, the drill's whine cutting through the fog like a mechanical scream, and it was only when dawn broke, a dawn that revealed itself not as golden light but as a suffocating, gray-white mist that rolled in from the water with the speed of a cavalry charge, that anyone had thought to question the ease of their success. Ronald Yates, the youngest member of the expedition at 24 and a recent graduate in marine geology from the University of Michigan, had been the one to notice the fog. He had been standing on the deck of the barge, stripping off his grease-stained coveralls after a 12-hour shift at the drill controls, when the air suddenly turned thick and wet against his face. It was not the slow, creeping mist of a typical Superior morning, the kind that hugged the waterline and burned off by noon. This was something else, a dense, opaque wall that seemed to materialize out of nothing, smelling of old blood and ozone, a metallic, coppery tang that coated the back of the throat and made the eyes water. Ronald had called out to the others, his voice sounding oddly muffled and distant even to his own ears, and he had watched in growing unease as the fog swallowed the shoreline, the supply sheds, and finally the other end of the barge itself, reducing their world to a circular bubble of visibility no more than 10 feet in diameter. And then he had seen the ripples. They were moving against the wind. The surface of the lake, which had been as flat and black as polished obsidian only moments before, was now disturbed by a series of concentric waves that emanated from a point somewhere in the fog and traveled directly toward the barge, moving with a steady, purposeful rhythm that suggested something massive was displacing water beneath the surface. Ronald had grabbed the binoculars from the instrument locker and pressed them to his eyes, peering into the gray nothingness, and for a fraction of a second, he had seen it. A long, copper-colored ridge breaking the surface, maybe 30 feet from the hull, scaling the water like the back of some impossible reptile before it sank beneath the chop and vanished. He had stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs, and he had run to the cabin to tell Thorn, to make the older man understand that there was something in the water, something alive and watching. But Thorn had only waved him away with an irritated flick of the wrist, dismissing the sighting as a floating log or a rogue wave, the hallucination of a tired young man who had spent too many hours staring at drill readouts in the dark. But now, in the cabin, with the radio dead and the copper sample vibrating with a violence that was causing microscopic fractures to spiderweb across the glass slide, Ronald found himself standing in the corner, his back pressed against the cold aluminum wall, his eyes fixed on the sample, and his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Thorn finally looked up from his microscope, and his face, usually so composed and disdainful, was drawn into a frown of genuine puzzlement. "It's resonating," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "At a frequency I can't identify. It's like it's responding to something." He reached for a seismograph pad that had been recording faint tremors from the lakebed, and his frown deepened. The needle had gone flat for 3 seconds, then spiked into a jagged, inhuman pattern that repeated every 7 seconds with mechanical precision. "There's a pulse," Thorn said, his voice losing some of its usual confidence, "coming from below." From the vein itself. Ronald wanted to scream at him that the pulse wasn't coming from the vein, that the pulse was coming from whatever had made the pulse, from the thing that was now pressing against the hull with enough force to make the entire cabin list 2 degrees to port. But his throat was locked shut with a terror so primal that he couldn't force sound past his vocal cords. The cabin walls groaned. The copper sample vibrated so violently that it flipped off the slide and landed on the steel table with a ringing chime that sounded almost like a bell. And then, from somewhere outside, from the water that pressed against the thin wooden hull like a hungry mouth, they heard the sound again. Not the snap of a muscle this time, but a breath. A long, wet, rattling inhalation that seemed to draw the air out of the cabin itself, pulling at their eardrums with a pressure change that made Ronald's nose bleed. It was the sound of something enormous taking in the scent of the copper they had stolen, and in that moment, as the oil lamps flickered and died, and the darkness swallowed them whole, Ronald understood with a clarity that would haunt him for the rest of his life that Dr. Aris Thorne had not discovered a new type of copper. He had desecrated a grave, and the grave's owner was now awake. The next morning, or what passed for morning in the perpetual twilight of the fog, the team gathered in the main cabin with the kind of forced cheerfulness that people adopt when they are terrified but unwilling to admit it. Thorne had recovered his composure sometime during the night, attributing the power fluctuations and the strange sounds to electrical storms that must have been passing far offshore, invisible in the fog but potent enough to cause atmospheric disturbances. He had cleaned the copper sample and placed it in a reinforced specimen case, and he had already drafted the first 3 pages of what he intended to be a groundbreaking paper on anomalous mineral resonance. The others, Webb, the navigator whose name was Delilah Cortez, a taciturn Canadian surveyor named Elias Vance, and Ronald, sat around the table picking at reconstituted eggs and listening to Thorne lecture with the zeal of a man trying to convince himself more than his audience. What we experienced last night was a classic example of piezoelectric excitation, Thorne declared, tapping the specimen case with a knuckle. Certain crystalline structures, when subjected to tectonic stress, can generate electric fields. That field likely interfered with our radio and lighting systems. Perfectly natural. Cortez, a lean woman with salt and pepper hair and 20 years of maritime navigation under her belt, had not touched her food. She was staring out the cabin's single porthole, her dark eyes tracking something in the fog that only she could see, and when Thorne finished his explanation, she spoke without turning around. "Doctor." "Thorne, I've sailed the Great Lakes for 2 decades. I've been through storms that turned freighters on their sides and ice that crushed hulls like paper cups. I know what the lake sounds like when it's angry. Last night wasn't the lake. Last night was something in the lake." Thorne had opened his mouth to reply with some cutting remark about the superstitions of sailors, but before he could speak, Webb burst through the cabin door, his face ashen, his massive hands trembling so badly that he had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. They had lost the borehole. Not collapsed, not flooded, lost. The entire drilling apparatus, a 40-ton assembly of steel and hydraulics that had taken 3 days to assemble and calibrate, was gone. The deck plates where it had been bolted down were twisted upward like petals, the steel sheared clean through as if by a massive pair of tin snips, and the drill string itself, a half-mile of interconnected pipe, had been pulled into the water with such force that the winch mechanism had been ripped from its moorings and deposited 20 feet away on the rocky shore. But it was not the destruction that had reduced Webb, a man who had once worked oil rigs in the North Sea, to a stuttering wreck. It was the water. The surface of the lake around the barge was covered in a film of copper dust, a fine, glittering powder that coated the rocks and the deck, and the sides of the cabin with a shimmering, iridescent sheen, and beneath that dust, the water was churning. Not with waves or wind, but with a slow, rhythmic bubbling that rose and fell like the breathing of a lung, each exhalation releasing a stench of ancient, decomposed matter and hot metal that made them all gag. And there were marks on the deck, long, parallel gouges in the wood, each one deep enough to catch a fingernail, spaced exactly 18 inches apart, running from the edge of the barge to the drill site and back again. They looked like claw marks. They looked like the marks of something that had climbed aboard, inspected its property, and then dragged that property back into the depths with it. Thorn stood at the edge of the ruined deck, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw working silently as he tried to fit this new data into his rigid worldview. He could not deny the destruction. He could not deny the marks. But he could, and did, construct an elaborate explanation involving a rogue whirlpool, a sudden subterranean gas eruption, and the galvanic corrosion of improperly treated steel. He spoke of these things in a rapid, clipped monotone, and as he spoke, Ronald watched the man's hands. They were shaking, not the tremor of cold or exhaustion, but the fine, uncontrollable shake of a man who has seen the edge of the abyss and is pretending he has not. "We'll need to salvage what we can," Thorn said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "The core samples are still in the storage locker. If we can get them back to Duluth, we can." He stopped, because Cortez was pointing. Her arm was extended over the water, her finger tracking something in the fog, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. They all turned. They all looked. And they all saw it, though some would later claim they had seen nothing, that it was a trick of the mist, a hallucination born of stress and lack of sleep. But Ronald saw it. He saw the eyes first, rising from the water like twin embers, each one the size of a dinner plate, glowing with a copper-orange luminescence that pierced the fog like searchlights. They were set in a head that was flat and broad, feline in its proportions but scaled like a fish, with two massive antlers or horns twisting upward from the skull and branching into points that looked sharp enough to impale a man. The head rose 6 feet above the waterline, and as it turned to survey the barge, they could see the body beneath it, a sinuous, muscular mass of fur and scales that seemed to shift and refract the light like the surface of the lake itself. It was there for 5 seconds, maybe 10. Then it sank, not with a splash, but with a silent, liquid displacement that left the water smoother than before, as if it had never been. The breathing sound returned, that wet, rattling inhalation, but now it was joined by another sound, a low, reverberating growl that seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating up through the deck plates and into their bones, a sound that said, with absolute predatory clarity, that they were no longer the hunters. They were the intruders, and the lake was taking inventory of its trespassers. Ronald did not sleep that night. None of them did, though they pretended to, each retreating to their narrow bunks in the sleeping quarters and lying rigid in the dark, listening to the sounds of the lake. The fog had thickened to the point of absurdity, a solid white wall that pressed against the windows and made the cabin feel like a tomb buried deep in the earth rather than a structure perched above the water. Every few minutes there would be a sound from below, a scrape, a thump, the groan of stressed metal, and each time Ronald would clench his fists so hard that his nails drew blood from his palms. He thought about the eyes. He thought about the copper dust. He thought about the guide's words that the lake did not like its bones being touched, and he realized with a sinking horror that the copper vein was not a random geological formation. It was part of something. It was connected to the thing in the water the way bone was connected to flesh, and by drilling into it, by extracting that glowing core, they had performed an act not of mining, but of butchery. They had lanced a boil on the back of a god, and now the god was feeling the pain. Thorn had told them that morning, with the manic brightness of a man clinging to sanity by his fingernails, that they would continue the survey. They had handheld drills, portable extraction equipment, enough supplies to take smaller samples from secondary sites. The corporation had paid for results, and results they would deliver. He had said this while standing in front of the storage locker where the iridescent cores were kept, and Ronald had noticed that Thorn had not opened the locker. He had not checked on his precious samples. It was as if he were afraid of what he might find inside, afraid that the copper might have changed, grown, awakened further in the darkness. The day passed in a haze of mechanical activity and creeping dread. They moved to a secondary drilling site 100 yards down the shore, setting up the smaller equipment on a rocky promontory that jutted out over a deep trench known locally as the Devil's Cauldron. The name had seemed quaint to Thorn when he had read it on the nautical charts, a bit of colorful nomenclature to entertain tourists. But now, as Ronald stood on the edge of that promontory and looked down into water so black it seemed to devour the sky, the name felt like a warning written in blood. They drilled for 6 hours, the portable auger chewing through shale and limestone, and by late afternoon they had extracted 3 smaller samples, none of which displayed the same iridescent quality as the first, but all of which seemed to hum faintly when placed together in the sample case. Thorn was ebullient, crowing about proof and publications, about the Nobel Prize in geology that surely awaited a man who could redefine the electromagnetic properties of native copper. And his enthusiasm was so desperate, so transparently false, that even Webb, usually the most loyal of lieutenants, began to avoid his gaze. It was Cortez who found the scale. She had been walking the perimeter of the promontory, taking GPS readings that seemed to drift and stutter in ways that made no sense, when her boot kicked something hard and metallic from the grass. It was a scale, roughly the size of her palm, shaped like a teardrop and colored the exact shade of oxidized copper that adorned the Statue of Liberty. But it was not copper. It was harder than diamond, with an edge so keen that, when Cortez reflexively ran her thumb along it, the skin split open as if touched by a razor, and blood welled up instantly. She dropped it with a cry, and the scale fell point down into a crevice in the rock, embedding itself to half its depth with the ease of a knife into butter. When they tried to extract it with pliers, the tool's steel jaws were notched and gouged, and the scale remained lodged in the stone as if it had grown there, a piece of the creature's hide shed like a calling card. Thorn insisted on photographing it, on measuring it, on speculating about its chemical composition, but his voice had taken on a high, strained quality, and he kept glancing over his shoulder at the water as if expecting to see those copper eyes rising again. Ronald pocketed one of the smaller fragments that had chipped off when the scale fell, slipping it into his jacket without knowing why, feeling the need to possess a piece of the evidence, a talisman of the reality that Thorn was so desperately trying to deny. As twilight fell, not a gradual dimming but a sudden, violent extinguishing of the gray light as if someone had thrown a switch, the fog began to move. It did not drift or dissipate. It organized itself into shapes. Long, sinuous tendrils of mist that seemed to crawl across the surface of the water with intentional, serpentine motion, weaving between the rocks and climbing the legs of the barge, feeling their way up the aluminum siding like blind fingers. Ronald watched from the cabin window as one of these tendrils pressed against the glass, and for a moment, just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a face in the fog, a flattened, bestial visage with eyes that glowed like banked coals, before the condensation swallowed the image and the tendril moved on. The radio remained dead. The satellite phone showed full signal but could connect to no network, each attempt met with a static hiss that sounded almost like laughter. The generators, which had been running smoothly all day, began to sputter and cough, their fuel lines somehow clogged with a fine, metallic grit that looked like copper dust when examined in the lamplight. And the samples, all of them, began to vibrate again, a synchronized, rhythmic trembling that matched the pulse Ronald had felt in his chest since the night before, a heartbeat that was not his own but belonged to the deep, to the thing that was circling their outpost with the patience of an apex predator that had already decided the outcome of the hunt. Thorn called a meeting in the main cabin, and they gathered around the table like condemned men awaiting sentencing, their faces pale and drawn, their hands wrapped around mugs of coffee that had gone cold and bitter. "We are scientists," Thorn began, his voice trembling only slightly. "We do not succumb to fear. We analyze, we categorize, we understand. Whatever we are dealing with here is an unknown species, a cryptid of some kind, perhaps a large aquatic mammal that has evolved protective armor plating. There is no supernatural element. There is no curse. There is only biology, and biology can be studied. Tomorrow we will set traps." We will install underwater cameras. We will capture this creature, alive if possible, and we will bring it to the world as the greatest zoological discovery of the century." He spoke these words with a conviction that bordered on religious fervor, and as he spoke, Ronald looked at the others. Webb was nodding slowly, his eyes vacant, his mind clearly broken by the stress and clinging to any explanation that offered hope. Cortez was shaking her head, very slightly, very steadily, her lips pressed together in a thin line of despair. And Vance, the silent Canadian, was staring at the copper sample on the table, and he was whispering something under his breath, something that sounded like a prayer in a language Ronald did not recognize. Outside, the fog pressed closer, and the sound of breathing from the lake grew louder, closer, and more eager, and Ronald knew, with the absolute certainty of a man who has already seen his own death, that tomorrow would not bring traps or cameras or scientific glory. Tomorrow would bring the storm, the real storm, the one that had been gathering in the deep for centuries, waiting for fools arrogant enough to steal from its bed. That night the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, a meteorological impossibility that caused the aluminum walls of the cabin to contract with sharp gunshot cracks that made them all leap from their bunks. The wind, which had been absent for days, suddenly roared to life, but it was not a natural wind. It blew in from the water with a sound like the screaming of a million voices, a hollow, booming howl that rattled the windows and threatened to tear the roof from its nails. Yet when Ronald dared to look outside, the surface of the lake was still. The fog did not move. The trees on the shore did not sway. The wind was blowing only against them, against the outpost, a directed assault of freezing air that smelled of copper and old blood and something else, something ancient and angry and patient beyond human understanding. Thorne had retreated to his private quarters, claiming he needed to review the data from the day's drilling, but Ronald could hear him through the thin wall, talking to himself in a rapid, frantic whisper, arguing with someone who was not there, defending his actions, justifying his presence, begging for understanding. The others huddled in the main cabin, wrapped in blankets that offered no warmth, listening to the wind and the breathing and the slow, rhythmic scraping that was coming from beneath the floorboards, as if something were testing the wood, searching for a weak point, a place to enter. Cortez had produced a flask of whiskey from her pack, and they passed it around in silence, each of them drinking deep and feeling no effect from the alcohol, their bodies too flooded with adrenaline to process intoxication. "My grandfather used to tell stories about this place," Cortez said suddenly, her voice cutting through the cacophony like a knife. "He said the Mishipeshu doesn't guard the copper because it owns it. He guards it because he is it. The copper is his blood. The lake is his skin. When you drill into the vein, you aren't mining. You're cutting him open." Webb had laughed, a brittle, hysterical sound, and he had told her to shut up, to stop filling their heads with ghost stories, but Ronald had seen the truth in her words. He had felt it the moment the first core sample came up, that sense of wrongness, of violation, of having committed an act so profane that the earth itself had shuddered in revulsion. And now the earth, or the lake, or the thing that called both of those things home, was preparing to exact its price. The wind died at midnight, not gradually but instantly, as if someone had placed a hand over the mouth of the world. The silence that followed was deeper and more terrible than the noise had been, a silence so complete that Ronald could hear the blood rushing in his ears, the synapses firing in his brain, the slow, wet grind of his own teeth as he clenched his jaw against the scream that was building in his chest. And then, from directly beneath the barge, there came a sound that none of them would ever be able to adequately describe, a sound that existed in frequencies both above and below human hearing, a sound that was felt in the marrow more than the ear. It was a roar, but not the roar of a lion or a bear. It was the roar of a mountain collapsing. It was the roar of a glacier calving into the sea. It was the roar of something so vast and so old that its voice had shaped the bedrock of the continent, and it was a roar of pain, of rage, of vengeance deferred for millennia and now finally unleashed. The barge lifted. Not rocked, not swayed, lifted. The entire structure rose 6 inches off its pilings as something massive passed beneath it, something that displaced thousands of tons of water in a single surge. And when the barge crashed back down, the impact was so violent that the cabin's windows shattered inward, spraying them with dagger-like shards of glass. The lights went out. The generators shrieked and died. And in the absolute darkness, they heard the first scream. It was Webb. It came from the deck, where he had gone to secure a line that had come loose during the lift. And it was a sound of such pure, unadulterated terror that it transcended language, transcended humanity, becoming a primal animal shriek of a creature that understood, in its final moment, that it was prey. There was a snap, wet and muscular, like the sound that had killed the radio but magnified 100-fold. And then Webb's scream was cut off with such abrupt finality that it left a ringing void in the air, a silence where a life had been. Ronald scrambled to the broken window, his hands bleeding from the glass, his eyes straining against the darkness, and he saw something that would etch itself into his memory like acid into steel. He saw Webb's legs, still kicking, disappearing beneath the surface of the black water, dragged by a long, sinuous appendage that wrapped around his waist with the casual strength of a python, a tail or a tentacle or a limb that had no name in human anatomy, scaled and copper-colored and ending in a flanged tip that glowed with the same iridescent light as the ore samples. Webb was gone in 3 seconds. The water closed over him without a ripple, and the only evidence that he had ever existed was a single smear of blood on the deck railing, already freezing in the sudden cold, and a jagged copper scale that had been left behind, spinning on the wood like a coin before it settled, flat and gleaming and impossibly sharp. The Mishipeshu had taken its first tribute, and from the lake, from the deep, from the bed where the copper veins pulsed like arteries in the flesh of the world, the breathing sound returned, steady and satisfied and hungry for more. The hours that followed Webb's death were not measured in minutes, but in heartbeats, each one a desperate, fluttering thing that seemed to echo in the hollow cavern of Ronald's chest like a bird trapped in a chimney. Thorne had taken charge with the brittle, manic energy of a man who knows he is doomed, but must continue the performance of leadership for the sake of his own sanity. He had ordered them to barricade themselves in the main cabin, to drag the heavy equipment lockers against the doors and nail blankets over the shattered windows, as if fabric and aluminum could stop something that had just dragged a 200-pound man into the abyss with the ease of a child pulling a weed from a garden. Cortez had not spoken since the scream. She sat in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her navigator's coat pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance where the wall met the ceiling, and she rocked back and forth with a slow, metronomic rhythm that suggested she had retreated to a place inside herself where the world could not reach her. Vance was at the other end of the cabin, methodically sharpening a hunting knife against a whetstone, the rasp of steel on stone a constant, grating accompaniment to the sounds from outside. He had not looked up from his task in 2 hours, and the blade had been honed to a surgical edge that reflected the candlelight with a cold, malevolent gleam. Ronald stood at the one window that had not been completely covered, peering through a crack in the blanket at the fog-shrouded deck where Webb had died, half expecting to see the man's body float to the surface, bloated and pale, but knowing with a certainty that made his stomach clench that they would never see Webb again. Not his body, not his bones. The lake had claimed him whole, and the lake did not give back what it took. The auditory disorientation began shortly before dawn, though dawn was a theoretical concept in the perpetual twilight of the fog. They had been sitting in the candle-lit gloom, none of them daring to sleep, when the first sound reached them. It was the sound of a storm, a full-throated, booming tempest with howling winds and crashing waves, and the distant, ominous rumble of thunder rolling across an open sea. But when Ronald pressed his eye to the crack in the blanket and looked outside, the water was as flat and still as a mirror. The fog hung motionless. The trees on the shore stood silent and rigid, their branches sheathed in frost, untouched by even the slightest breeze. Yet the storm raged in their ears, a cacophony of elemental fury that seemed to emanate from the lake itself, from the water, from the depths, a sound that bypassed the eardrums and resonated directly in the teeth and the sinuses and the hollow spaces behind the eyes. It was not a recording. It was not an illusion. It was the memory of a storm, or the promise of one, a sonic manifestation of the creature's power over its domain, and it served a purpose that became horrifyingly clear as the minutes passed. The storm sounds moved. They circled the outpost like a shark circling a wounded swimmer, shifting from the east to the west to the north, each change in direction accompanied by a change in intensity, a modulation that suggested not random weather but deliberate, predatory acoustics. The creature was using the sound to mask its movements, to confuse their sense of direction, to make it impossible to tell where the next attack would come from. Thorn had pressed his hands over his ears, his face twisted into a grimace of intellectual agony, and he had shouted something about infrasound and biological sonar, about how certain animals could generate vibrations that disoriented prey. But his words were swallowed by the noise, rendered meaningless by the reality that the noise was not a tool but a voice that was speaking a language of terror that predated human speech by millions of years. Ronald found himself thinking about the copper scale in his pocket, the small chip he had taken from the larger scale Cortez had found on the promontory. It was warm against his thigh, unnaturally warm, as if it were generating its own heat, and he could feel it pulsing in sync with the phantom storm, a tiny heartbeat that matched the rhythm of the thing outside. He pulled it from his pocket and held it in his palm, and in the candlelight he saw that the scale had changed. Where it had been a flat, teardrop-shaped flake of copper-colored material, it was now curved, cupping inward like a tiny bowl, and its edges had grown serrated, each tooth no larger than a grain of sand but sharp enough to draw blood when he accidentally brushed his thumb across them. It was growing. It was adapting. It was, he realized with a nausea that made his knees weak, still part of the creature, still connected to it in some way that defied distance and physics, a piece of the Mishipeshu's hide that remained alive and aware even when separated from the body. He dropped it on the table, and it landed with a ringing chime that cut through the storm noise like a bell, a pure, crystalline tone that made the candles flicker and the blankets stir. Thorn looked at the scale, and for a moment the mask of scientific denial slipped from his face, revealing the raw, gibbering terror beneath. "Get rid of it," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the roaring in their ears. "Throw it back. Throw it all back." But no one moved. No one dared to open the door, to step onto the deck, to approach the water that lapped against the hull with a sound that was almost eager. The second death came not with a scream but with a whisper. Vance had been the most stoic of them, the most prepared, the most convinced that steel and willpower could overcome any threat, animal or otherwise. He had spent the night sharpening his knife and checking his gear, and when the storm sounds had reached their peak, he had announced, in a flat, emotionless voice, that he was going to check the mooring lines. The barge had shifted during the initial attack, and if it broke free of its pilings, they would be adrift, helpless, at the mercy of the wind and the current and whatever might be waiting in the fog. Thorn had tried to stop him, had grabbed his arm with a desperation that bordered on begging, but Vance had shaken him off with a contemptuous sneer and slipped through the barricaded door into the darkness beyond. They had listened to his footsteps on the deck, the slow, careful tread of a man who knows he is being hunted, and then they had heard him stop. Just stop. The footsteps ceased, and there was a moment of absolute silence, a pocket of stillness in the midst of the phantom storm, and then Vance spoke. He said a single word, a name or a curse or a prayer in French, "Mon Dieu," and then there was a sound like a wet towel being snapped, a sharp cracking report that was immediately followed by the clatter of the hunting knife falling to the deck. They waited. They listened. The storm sounds moved away from the barge, retreating toward the shore, and in the silence that followed they heard something new. It was Vance's voice, but it was wrong. It was coming from the water, from somewhere beneath the barge, and it was calling to them. "Thorn," it said, in a perfect imitation of Vance's Quebecois accent. "Ronald, Cortez, come out, it's safe. I can see the shore. We can swim for it." The voice was warm, inviting, almost seductive in its reasonableness, and for a mad instant Ronald found himself rising from his chair, his hand reaching for the door latch, his mind filled with images of a calm, moonlit lake and a safe swim to the beach. But Cortez, still rocking in her corner, suddenly lunged forward and grabbed his wrist with a strength that made him cry out. Her eyes were wide and clear, the fog of shock burned away by some primal instinct that recognized the trap. "That's not him," she whispered, her voice raw and ragged. "That's not him. It never is." And she was right. Because as the voice continued to call, urging them to come out, to join him, to escape the barge and swim to safety, they began to hear the other sounds beneath it. The wet, gurgling sounds of a throat that was not quite human, filled with water and blood, and something that clicked and rattled like scales rubbing together. The voice was a lure, a bait, a perfect mimicry designed to draw them into the open, where the creature could take them one by one without the inconvenience of breaking down doors. They did not answer. They did not move. They sat in the candlelit darkness, listening to their dead friend call to them with increasing urgency, then with pleading, then with anger, then with a despair so profound that it brought tears to Ronald's eyes despite his knowledge of the deception. The voice cycled through emotions like a radio scanning frequencies, trying each one in turn, searching for the frequency that would make them crack, make them open the door, make them step into the fog. And when it finally realized they would not come, the voice changed again. It became Webb's voice. It became the voice of Thorn's mother, dead for 15 years. It became the voice of a child crying for help, a child that sounded so much like Ronald's younger sister that he had to stuff his fist into his mouth to keep from screaming. The creature was inside their heads, plucking memories from their minds like a harpist plucking strings, turning their love and their loss against them with a cruelty that was as precise as it was inhuman. The storm sounds returned, redoubled, a tidal wave of auditory horror that battered against the walls of the cabin and made the candles gutter and die. And in the absolute darkness, they heard the scratching. It was coming from beneath the floorboards, from the space between the barge's hull and the waterline, from the walls themselves. Long, slow scrapes, parallel and rhythmic, the sound of claws being dragged across wood and metal, testing, searching, mapping the structure for weakness. The creature was no longer content to wait for them to come out. It was coming in. Thorn had found a flare gun in the emergency locker, and he clutched it now with the desperate fervor of a man holding a crucifix before a vampire. He had loaded it with a single magnesium charge, and he pointed it at the door, then at the floor, then at the ceiling, his hands shaking so violently that the barrel described wild arcs in the darkness. "It can't get in," he kept saying, a mantra of denial that grew weaker with each repetition. "It's too big. It can't fit through the doors. It's too big." But they all knew that size was not the issue. The thing outside was not bound by the rules of terrestrial biology, by the constraints of skeletal structure and muscle mass. It was a spirit, a god, a force of nature given flesh, and if it wanted to enter the cabin, it would find a way. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then they heard a splintering crack from the corner of the room, a sound of wood giving way under impossible pressure. A thin jet of water sprayed into the cabin, black and freezing, smelling of copper and decay, and in the glow of Thorn's struck match, they saw a single claw, long and curved and iridescent as the core samples, poking through the sodden plywood. It flexed, it tested the air, and then it withdrew, leaving a hole the size of a fist that gaped like a wound, water trickling through it in a steady, maddening stream that pooled on the floor and soaked their boots. The message was clear. The creature could enter whenever it chose. It was simply enjoying the game. The siege of the outpost lasted through what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 6 hours. 6 hours of auditory torment and structural assault that reduced them to animals, cowering in the dark, sobbing and praying and clawing at their own skin in a futile attempt to escape the sounds. The creature circled the barge, and as it moved, it churned the lake into a frenzy, not with wind or weather but with the sheer displacement of its own mass, its passage through the water creating whirlpools and cross-currents that sucked at the hull and made the structure groan and twist on its pilings. They felt the barge shift, tilting by degrees as the water level beneath one side dropped and then surged, and they heard the supply boats, the 2 small skiffs they had planned to use for emergency evacuation, being pulled under with a series of wet, bubbling gurgles that sounded almost like laughter. The creature was claiming the territory, destroying their means of escape, shrinking the island of safety around them until there was nothing left but the cabin itself, a fragile box of wood and aluminum suspended above a lake that had become a living, hungry thing. Ronald had retreated to the highest point he could find, climbing onto the equipment locker and pressing his back against the ceiling, as if elevation could save him from a creature of the deep. He watched the hole in the wall, watched the water pooling on the floor, watched the shadows cast by Thorn's guttering match, and he felt his mind beginning to fray at the edges. He was no longer a geologist, no longer a rational man of science. He was a cornered animal, a rabbit in a burrow with a fox digging at the entrance, and the only thing that kept him from complete collapse was the memory of the eyes, those copper-orange eyes that had regarded the barge with an intelligence that was not animal and not human, but something older and colder, and infinitely more patient. The creature was not killing them quickly because it did not want to. It was savoring the fear, the despair, the slow unraveling of their sanity. It was feeding on something more nourishing than flesh. Cortez was the first to break. She had been silent for hours, her rocking motion gradually slowing until she sat perfectly still, perfectly rigid, her eyes closed and her lips moving in a soundless litany that might have been prayer or might have been madness. Then, without warning, she stood up, her movements calm and deliberate, and she walked toward the door. Thorn screamed at her, dropping the flare gun and lunging to intercept her, but she moved with a speed that suggested she had been planning this for hours, or perhaps that something else was moving her, some compulsion planted in her mind by the creature's voice. She reached the door, unbarred it with a single fluid motion, and stepped out onto the deck before anyone could stop her. The fog swallowed her instantly, a white curtain that closed behind her with a wet, viscous finality, and they heard her footsteps on the deck, then on the gangplank, then on the rocky shore, moving with a steady, unhurried pace toward the water. Thorn had snatched up the flare gun and run to the door, screaming her name, but when he looked out there was nothing but fog. The footsteps continued for another 10 seconds, then stopped. There was a splash, small and soft, like a stone dropped into a pond. And then from the direction of the splash they heard Cortez's voice, warm and welcoming, calling to them. "The water's fine," she said. "It's so warm, come in and rest." Thorn had slammed the door and barred it again, and he had slid down the wall until he sat on the floor, the flare gun in his lap, his face in his hands, making a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Ronald watched him, and he felt no pity, only a distant, numb recognition that Thorn's hubris had brought them here, that the man's contempt for myth and warning had been the catalyst for this massacre, and that the price for that hubris was being paid in lives that were not Thorn's own. The scientist had not been the first to die, but in many ways he was the most dead of them all, because he had lost the thing he valued most, his certainty. The physical siege continued as the creature, having claimed 2 more victims through deception, turned its attention back to the structure itself. They heard it climbing onto the roof, the heavy, dragging sound of a massive body pulling itself up the aluminum siding, each movement accompanied by the screech of tortured metal and the snapping of bolts. The roof groaned under a weight that should have collapsed it instantly, and they heard the rasp of scales against the corrugated steel, the heavy, wet exhalations of breath that filled the cabin with the stench of copper and ancient decay. Water began to pour through the seams in the roof, not rain but lake water, forced through the gaps by the creature's weight and movement, and the cabin began to flood, the black, freezing liquid rising around their ankles, then their calves, then their knees. Thorn had climbed onto the table, dragging the specimen case with him, clutching it to his chest like a life preserver, and Ronald had joined him, the two of them perched on the last island of dry wood in a sinking ship, staring up at the ceiling as the metal buckled and bent inward under the pressure from above. And then, for the first time, they saw it in full light. A section of the roof peeled back like the lid of a tin can, torn away by a claw the size of a shovel, and the fog poured in, white and thick and alive, and in the center of that fog they saw the silhouette. It was massive, filling the entire aperture of the torn roof, a chimera of scale and fur and horn, its body a muscular, impossible amalgamation of feline grace and reptilian bulk, its antlers branching outward like the roots of an inverted tree, its eyes, those terrible, glowing copper eyes, fixed on them with a focus that was utterly, terrifyingly personal. It was not looking at them as prey. It was looking at them as debtors, as thieves, as beings who had taken something that belonged to it and now had to pay the price. The head lowered through the hole, the jaws opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth, each one the same copper color as the scales, each one sharp enough to pierce steel. The roar that followed was not a sound but a physical force, a wall of pressure that slammed into them with enough strength to knock Ronald off the table and into the freezing water that now filled the cabin. He went under, his mouth filling with the copper-tasting, black liquid, his eyes open and staring up at the light from the torn roof, and for a moment he was certain that the jaws would close around him, that the teeth would find his flesh and drag him down into the dark where the others waited. But the bite did not come. Instead, he felt a pressure against his chest, a massive, scaled limb pushing him down, holding him under the water not to drown him but to assert dominance, to show him that his life existed only because the creature allowed it, to force him into submission before the god of the deep. He stopped struggling. He stopped fighting. He went limp, his body floating in the black water, his lungs burning, his mind dimming, and he felt the pressure lift. When he broke the surface, gasping and retching, the creature was gone. The roof was torn open, the fog pouring in, but the silhouette had vanished, and the only sound was the lapping of water and Thorn's insane, hysterical laughter from somewhere across the flooded cabin. The Mishipeshu had made its point. The siege was over, but the hunt was far from finished. Ronald did not remember crawling out of the water. He did not remember pulling himself onto the table or huddling next to Thorn in the sodden ruin of the cabin. The next thing he was truly aware of was the cold, a bone-deep, marrow-freezing cold that had penetrated his clothes and his skin and settled into his muscles like a parasite, making his teeth chatter so violently that he feared they would shatter against each other. Thorn was beside him, and the older man had changed. The manic energy of denial had burned itself out, leaving behind a hollow shell that twitched and stared with the glassy eyes of a trauma patient. He clutched the specimen case to his chest, but his grip was loose, careless, as if he had forgotten why the copper was important, as if the metal had become a burden rather than a prize. The cabin was destroyed. The roof gaped open to the fog like a mouth, and the floor was submerged beneath 2 feet of black, stagnant water that reflected the pale gray light in oily swirls. Their supplies were ruined, their equipment destroyed, their means of communication and escape obliterated by the creature's systematic dismantling of their outpost. They were trapped on a sinking barge in the middle of a fog-shrouded lake, and the only thing standing between them and the water was a structure that was slowly tearing itself apart under the combined assault of the flooding and the thing that still circled beneath them, waiting, always waiting. But the immediate attack had ceased. The creature had withdrawn, or at least pulled back, and in the relative quiet, a new kind of horror began to take root in Ronald's mind. The horror of hope. "We have to give it back," Ronald said, his voice a rasp that barely carried over the sound of water dripping from the ceiling. Thorn didn't look at him. "The copper, the samples, we have to throw them all back into the lake. Maybe then it will let us go." The idea had formed during his submersion, during those terrible seconds when the creature had held him under not to kill but to dominate. He had felt something in that moment, a transmission of intent that bypassed language and lodged directly in his hindbrain, a message as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. The copper was not theirs. It had never been theirs, and the lake wanted its bones returned. Thorn finally turned his head, and his eyes were empty, devoid of the arrogance and certainty that had defined him. "You think it wants a trade?" he asked, his voice flat and toneless. "You think we can negotiate with it, pay a toll and walk away?" Ronald didn't know. He didn't know anything anymore except that they were going to die if they stayed in this cabin, and dying in the water seemed marginally worse than dying on dry land. "It's all we have," he said. "The samples, the cores, we dump them overboard and maybe it stops, maybe it's enough." Thorn laughed, a dry, humorless sound that was more cough than mirth. "You don't understand, it's not about the copper. It was never about the copper, it's about the act. The violation. We drilled into its flesh, Ronald. We took its blood, and now it wants ours in return." But despite his words, Thorn's hands moved to the specimen case, almost of their own accord, and he flipped the latches open with trembling fingers. Inside, wrapped in insulating foam and plastic, were the core samples, 8 cylinders of iridescent copper that pulsed with a faint, internal light even in the gloom of the ruined cabin. They looked different now. Where they had been beautiful, almost magical in their glow, they now seemed diseased, corrupted, like tumors cut from a living body that continued to twitch and bleed after excision. Thorn stared at them, and Ronald saw something shift in the man's face, a calculation forming behind the dead eyes, a desperate gambit taking shape in a mind that was grasping at the last straws of survival. "We don't just throw them in," Thorn said slowly, his voice gaining a semblance of its old authority though it trembled at the edges like a frayed wire. "We make a show of it, a ritual. We honor the entity, we acknowledge the debt. We place the samples on the deck, we kneel, we show submission, and then we cast them into the water. Maybe it understands respect. Maybe it understands penance." Ronald wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that there was a logic to this nightmare, a set of rules that could be followed, a transaction that could be made. But as he looked at the samples, at the way they seemed to lean toward the water as if yearning for return, he felt a deep, sickening certainty that Thorn was wrong. The creature did not want penance. It did not want respect. It wanted something that could not be given back, something that had been destroyed the moment the drill bit pierced the vein. But they had no other options. They could not fight. They could not flee. They could only kneel and hope that the god of the lake accepted their offering, or at least found their groveling entertaining enough to prolong their lives for another hour. They gathered the samples, all 8 cores plus the smaller fragments, and the chip from the scale that Ronald had kept in his pocket, and they placed them in the specimen case with the solemnity of priests preparing a sacrifice. The case was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested, as if the copper were generating its own gravity, pulling toward the Earth's core with a force that made Ronald's arms ache as he lifted it. Thorn found a length of rope in the emergency locker, sodden but still strong, and he tied it around the case's handle, intending to lower it into the water from the deck rather than simply throwing it, a gesture of care that he hoped would demonstrate their sincerity. It was pathetic, Ronald knew. It was the bargaining of ants with a boot, but it was all they had. They emerged from the cabin into a world transformed. The fog had changed. Where it had been white and opaque, it was now tinged with copper, a pale, orange-pink luminescence that seemed to emanate from the water itself, casting everything in the sickly glow of a dying fire. The deck was slick with a film of the same copper dust that had coated the water after Webb's death, and their boots crunched on it with a sound like walking on broken glass. The barge had settled lower in the water, its hull groaning and popping as the weight of the flooding pulled it down toward the pilings, and Ronald could feel the structure listing to port, a slow, inevitable tilt that suggested it had minutes rather than hours before it slipped beneath the surface. They moved to the stern, where the railing overlooked the deepest part of the trench, and they knelt on the copper-slicked deck, the specimen case between them, their heads bowed in a posture of submission that felt unnatural and humiliating but necessary. Thorne spoke first, his voice carrying across the still water with a clarity that seemed almost amplified by the fog. "We return what we took," he said, his words formal and stiff, like lines from a play he had not rehearsed. "We acknowledge your claim. We acknowledge our error. Take back your blood and let us leave in peace." He untied the rope and gripped the case, preparing to lower it over the side, and Ronald held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. For a long moment nothing happened. The fog drifted, the water lapped, the barge groaned. Then from the depths they heard the breathing. It was closer than before, much closer, rising from directly beneath them like a subterranean wind, and the surface of the water began to bubble and churn. Ronald's hand shot out, grabbing Thorne's wrist, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the physical manifestation of the creature, and everything to do with the sound that accompanied the breathing. It was laughter. Low, wet, rattling laughter, a sound that had no right to exist in nature, a sound that spoke of amusement so cruel and so ancient that it made Ronald's bladder release in a warm, shameful rush down his leg. The creature was laughing at them. It was laughing at their offering, at their ritual, at their pathetic attempt to buy back their lives with the very thing they had stolen. And as the laughter grew louder, the water began to rise. It didn't surge or wave. It simply rose, climbing the hull of the barge with a smooth, deliberate motion that defied gravity and hydraulics, a wall of black liquid that reached the deck railing and then kept climbing, curling over the top like a tongue and spilling across the deck in a slow, inexorable flood. Ronald scrambled backward, dragging Thorne with him, but the water followed, pooling around their knees, their thighs, their waists, and it was warm, unnaturally warm, like the blood of a living thing. The specimen case was still on the deck, the copper samples glowing brighter now, pulsing in sync with the laughter, and the water reached them and lifted them, buoying them up as if the lake itself were cradling them, holding them in place rather than drowning them. And then they saw it. The head rose from the center of the flooded deck, breaking the surface of the water that now covered the barge, and it was not the same as before. It was larger, more defined, more terrible in its detail. They could see the individual scales, each one etched with patterns that looked like circuitry or runes, ancient symbols that glowed with the same iridescence as the copper. They could see the fur, a coarse, copper-colored mane that framed the feline face like a halo of rusted wire. They could see the antlers, branching and rebranching into a crown of thorns that scraped against the remnants of the roof and sent showers of sparks cascading down into the water. And they could see the eyes. The eyes were not glowing now. They were open, fully open, pupils dilated to black pits surrounded by rings of molten copper, and they were looking not at the specimen case, not at the offering, but at them. Directly at them, with a hunger that was personal, intimate, and utterly inescapable. The creature opened its mouth, and the rows of copper teeth parted, and from that maw came a sound that was not a roar but a word. A single, thundering syllable that resonated in their bones and made their vision blur and their ears bleed. It was not a word in any human language, but Ronald understood it anyway. It was a name. The name of the thing they had wounded. The name of the god whose blood they had spilled. And the name was a curse. The water receded as suddenly as it had come, draining off the deck with a sucking sound that left the wood bare and steaming, and the creature sank with it, its eyes the last thing to disappear beneath the surface, 2 embers glowing in the dark before they winked out and were gone. The specimen case remained on the deck untouched. The copper samples were still inside, still glowing, still waiting. The offering had been rejected. The debt had not been paid. It had been multiplied. Thorn collapsed onto his hands and knees, vomiting into the copper dust that coated the deck, his body convulsing with sobs that were indistinguishable from screams. Ronald stood frozen, the warm urine in his pants already turning cold against his skin, his mind a blank slate wiped clean by the encounter with something that existed so far beyond his comprehension that he could not even frame a thought about it. The creature had shown them, with perfect, devastating clarity, that there was no trade to be made. There was no forgiveness to be bargained for. The violation could not be undone by returning the stolen property, because the violation itself was the crime, and the punishment was not a fine or a sacrifice but annihilation. The Mishipeshu was not interested in their copper. It was interested in their fear, their despair, their slow, delicious unraveling, and it had just demonstrated with the eloquence of a god that it would take its time with them, that it would play with them, that it would make their deaths a symphony of terror that would echo across the lake for generations to come. The psychological horror that followed was worse than any physical attack could have been. The creature began to toy with them in earnest, using its mimicry to isolate them, to turn them against each other, to make every shadow and every sound a potential threat. Thorn had retreated to the far corner of the cabin, wedging himself between two equipment lockers in a space so narrow that Ronald doubted he could extricate himself without help, and he sat there with his knees drawn up to his chest, the flare gun clutched in his lap, his eyes darting from wall to wall with the frenetic energy of a trapped rodent. Ronald had tried to approach him, to discuss some new plan, some desperate strategy for survival, but Thorn had shrieked at him to stay away, accusing him of being the creature in disguise, of wearing Ronald's face like a mask, of luring him into a trap. The paranoia was infectious. Ronald found himself staring at Thorn, wondering if the man he saw was truly the doctor, or if the creature had already taken him and left a simulacrum in his place, a hollow puppet designed to keep Ronald docile until the real attack came. He found himself listening to the sounds of the cabin, the creak of the hull, the drip of water, the wind in the torn roof, and hearing voices in each of them, his mother's voice calling him home, his father's voice scolding him for being foolish, Cortez's voice whispering that the water was warm and inviting. The creature was inside the cabin now, not physically but psychically, its presence permeating the air like a toxin, warping their perceptions and feeding on the doubt and suspicion that bloomed in their minds like poisonous flowers. They stopped speaking to each other. They stopped making eye contact. They existed in a state of mutual terror, each one a potential enemy, each sound a potential threat, and the hours stretched into an eternity of suspense that was more agonizing than any quick death could have been. Ronald began to hear the footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible above the ambient sounds of the dying barge, but they grew louder with each passing hour, a slow, deliberate tread of something heavy walking on the deck outside the cabin, back and forth, pacing, waiting. Sometimes the footsteps would stop directly outside the door and they would hear the breathing, that wet, rattling inhalation, and then the footsteps would resume, circling the cabin, circling the outpost, circling their shrinking island of sanity. And then the voices began again, but they were different now. They were not trying to lure them out. They were reporting. "Thorn is hiding in the corner," Webb's voice would say, drifting through the fog with a conversational casualness that was more terrible than any scream. "He's got the flare gun. He thinks it will save him." And then Cortez's voice, "Ronald is by the window. He's watching the water. He's wondering if he can swim to shore before it catches him. He can't." The creature was narrating their thoughts, their positions, their pathetic hopes and fears, broadcasting them across the fog like a sports announcer describing a game whose outcome was already decided. It was breaking them down, stripping away their privacy, their dignity, their sense of self, until they were nothing but animals in a cage, monitored and mocked by a predator that understood them better than they understood themselves. Ronald stuffed his ears with scraps of foam from the ruined bedding, but the voices bypassed his eardrums, resonating in his skull, in his teeth, in the fillings of his molars, impossible to block out. He screamed, pounding his fists against his temples until his skin split and blood ran down his cheeks, but the voices continued, patient and amused and utterly merciless. Thorn broke first, as Ronald had known he would. The man who had built his life on certainty and control could not survive in a world where both had been obliterated. He emerged from his corner in the middle of what passed for night, his face a mask of utter madness, his eyes wide and white, and seeing nothing that existed in the physical world. He walked to the center of the cabin, the flare gun still in his hand, and he began to speak, not to Ronald but to the creature, to the fog, to the lake itself. "I am Aris Thorn," he shouted, his voice cracking and soaring into hysteria. "I am a doctor of geology. I have published 17 papers. I have a grant from the National Science Foundation. I do not believe in you. I do not acknowledge you. You are a hallucination. You are a mass hysteria induced by piezoelectric fields and infrasound. You are not real." He fired the flare gun into the roof, the magnesium charge exploding through the torn metal and rising into the fog in a blinding arc of white light that illuminated the entire outpost for 3 seconds of absolute, terrible clarity. In that light, Ronald saw the deck covered in scales, hundreds of them, thousands of them, arranged in patterns that spelled out words in languages that had not been spoken for 10,000 years. He saw the water around the barge teeming with movement, with sinuous shapes that twisted and coiled, and reached toward the light with grasping, scaled appendages. He saw the creature itself, fully visible for the first time, wrapped around the barge like a snake around an egg, its body a mile long at least, its antlers branching into the fog like the masts of a sunken ship, its eyes fixed on Thorn with an expression that could only be described as recognition. And then the light died, and the darkness rushed back in, and the creature moved. The deck beneath Thorn's feet erupted upward, splintering like a grenade, and a scaled limb, thicker than a tree trunk, wrapped around the doctor's waist with a speed that made it seem almost gentle. Thorn didn't scream. He simply looked down at the appendage with an expression of profound, almost religious surprise, as if he had finally found the proof he had been seeking, and then he was gone, pulled into the fog with a wet, sucking sound that was immediately followed by a crunch, a snap, and a silence that was deeper than any that had come before. The flare gun clattered to the deck, smoking and empty, and Ronald was alone. The isolation was absolute and immediate. With Thorn gone, the voices ceased, the footsteps ceased, the breathing ceased. The creature withdrew, leaving Ronald in a silence so complete that it rang in his ears like a physical pain, and he understood with a clarity that cut through his terror like a scalpel that he was being given a choice. Not a choice to live or die, that had been decided long ago, but a choice in how he would meet his end. He could fight, as Thorn had fought, and be torn apart in a frenzy of defiance. He could flee, as Cortez had fled, and be lured into the water by false promises of warmth and safety. Or he could submit. He could acknowledge with every fiber of his being that he was nothing, that he was less than nothing, that he was an ant that had dared to crawl across the foot of a giant, and was now awaiting the inevitable consequence of that hubris. He dropped to his knees on the blood-slicked deck, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that felt both humiliating and liberating, and he bowed his head until his forehead touched the copper dust that coated the wood. He did not pray. He did not beg. He simply submitted, emptying his mind of hope and fear and thought itself, becoming a blank slate, a non-entity, a thing so insignificant that the creature might not even bother to crush it. He stayed in that position for hours, his body cramping, his bladder releasing again, his mind drifting in a meditative void that was the only refuge left to him. And the creature watched. He could feel its eyes on him, 2 points of copper heat in the fog evaluating him, measuring him, deciding whether his submission was genuine or merely another gambit. But Ronald was beyond gambits. He was beyond hope. He was simply waiting in absolute surrender for whatever came next. When the attack finally came, it was not against him. The barge shuddered, not from beneath but from above, and Ronald heard the crash of the creature's body landing on the roof, the tearing of metal, the snapping of the last supports that held the cabin together. He did not look up. He did not move. He remained kneeling, his head bowed, his body limp and unresisting, as the roof was peeled back and the fog poured in and the massive head descended into the cabin, filling the space with its stench of copper and ancient blood. He could feel the breath on his neck, hot and wet and smelling of the deep, and he could hear the clicking of teeth inches from his skull, a sound like knitting needles made of bone. The creature sniffed him, a long, wet inhalation that ruffled his hair and made his skin crawl with a revulsion so deep it bordered on religious ecstasy. It was smelling his submission, tasting his surrender, and Ronald knew that if he moved, if he twitched, if he showed even the slightest hint of resistance or fear, the teeth would close and his skull would shatter like an eggshell. But he did not move. He became stone, he became water, he became nothing, and the creature, after what felt like an eternity of inspection, made a sound that was almost a sigh, a huff of warm air that stank of ozone and decay, and it withdrew. The head rose back through the torn roof. The body shifted on the deck above, a heavy, dragging sound that moved toward the stern and then paused. And then, with a splash that was almost gentle, it was gone. Ronald remained kneeling for another hour, waiting for the return, for the trick, for the inevitable resumption of the hunt. But the fog began to thin, the copper luminescence faded, the water in the cabin stopped rising. And slowly, incrementally, the world returned to something resembling normal, though Ronald knew, with a certainty that would define the rest of his existence, that normal was an illusion, that the creature had simply chosen to let him live, and that his life was now a gift that could be revoked at any moment, by any ripple, by any breath, by any distant, muffled roar that might drift across the years to remind him of the debt he still owed to the deep. The flooding began in earnest shortly after the creature's withdrawal, not as an attack, but as a consequence, the damaged barge finally surrendering to the water that had been slowly claiming it for hours. Ronald heard the whole breach before he saw it, a sharp, metallic crack like a gunshot that echoed through the lower compartments, followed by the thunderous rush of water pouring into spaces that had been dry since the structure was assembled. He rose from his kneeling position on the deck, his joints screaming in protest, his muscles stiff and locked from the hours of immobility, and he stumbled toward the sound not because he wanted to confront it, but because he had nowhere else to go. The cabin was destroyed, the roof gone, the walls buckling inward under the pressure of the listing structure, and the deck itself was tilting at a 15-degree angle toward the water, a slow, inevitable slide into the abyss that seemed almost polite in its patience. The lower levels of the drilling rig, the submersible compartments that housed the power generators and the sample storage lockers and the heavy pumping equipment, were already half submerged, and as Ronald descended the slippery metal stairs into the dark, he could hear the water churning below, black and freezing and alive with the debris of their failed expedition. He should have fled to the shore. He should have tried to swim, to run, to escape the sinking structure before it dragged him down. But some part of him, some broken, traumatized instinct that had been rewired by his submission to the creature, understood that the water was not the enemy. The water was the judge, and he was being called to witness the final verdict. The lower corridor was a nightmare of rising black water and sparking electrical wires, the air thick with steam, and the smell of burning insulation. Ronald waded through it, the freezing liquid climbing his legs with a sensation that started as pain and quickly numbed into a distant, detached coldness, and he used the dying emergency lights to navigate the maze of pipes and conduits that lined the walls. The generators were gone, submerged and silenced, but the water itself seemed to glow with a faint, copper-colored luminescence that provided just enough illumination to show him the shapes floating in the current, equipment, clothing, and other things. He saw Webb's boot first, a heavy rubber work boot still laced and trailing a shred of denim, bumping against the ceiling of the corridor as the water level rose. Then a clipboard, then a hard hat, then a hand, pale and bloated, fingers curled into a claw, drifting past him with the gentle current of the flooding compartment. He did not scream. He had no screams left in him. He simply pushed past the hand, his eyes averted, his mind a blank wall, and he followed the sound of the deepest water, the sound of the main borehole chamber where they had first breached the vein. That was where the creature would be. That was where the final act would play out. The borehole chamber was the largest room in the substructure, a cylindrical space 20 feet across dominated by the massive drilling apparatus that had been ripped from its moorings and now lay half-submerged against the far wall like a broken toy. The water here was deeper, rising faster, already chest-high and climbing, and it was warmer than the water in the corridor, almost hot, as if it were being heated from below by some subterranean source. The copper luminescence was stronger here too, pulsing in waves that matched the rhythm of Ronald's own heartbeat, or perhaps his heartbeat had simply synchronized to the pulse of the vein, his body becoming a tuning fork for the metal that ran through the bedrock beneath his feet. He waded to the center of the chamber, to the place where the borehole itself gaped open in the floor, a dark circle no wider than a manhole but infinitely more terrifying, a direct conduit to the depths where the copper veins ran like arteries through the stone. The water was pouring into that hole, draining downward with a sucking sound that suggested the earth itself was inhaling, drinking the lake and everything in it, and Ronald stood at the edge, looking down into the darkness, waiting. He did not have to wait long. The creature rose from the borehole not with a splash, but with a smooth, liquid displacement that suggested it was part of the water itself, inseparable from the medium that had birthed it. Ronald saw it in full light for the first and last time, and the image burned itself into his retinas with a permanence that would haunt his dreams for decades to come. It was not merely large. It was impossible, a chimera of biological categories that had no right to exist in the same body. The head was feline, broad and flat with a snout that tapered to a lipless mouth lined with those terrible copper teeth. But the fur that covered it was not fur at all but a dense, overlapping coat of scales that shifted and refracted the light like the surface of a soap bubble. The antlers branched from its skull in a crown of bone and metal, each tine sharp enough to pierce steel, and they were draped with strands of some organic matter that looked like seaweed but moved with a sentient, questing motion of their own. The eyes, those terrible copper eyes, glowed with an inner fire that was not reflection but combustion, as if the creature's brain were a furnace burning with the heat of the Earth's core. But it was the body that defied comprehension. It was serpentine, muscular, endless, coiling through the water and out of the borehole with a continuous, flowing motion that suggested its length was measured in fathoms rather than feet. Along its spine, where the scales gave way to a ridge of protrusions, there was a line of crystalline formations that looked exactly like the core samples they had extracted, iridescent copper growths that pulsed with the same internal light. And Ronald understood, in that moment of absolute revelation, that the creature was not guarding the copper. It was the copper. The vein was not a geological feature but a biological one, the circulatory system of a god that slept beneath the lake, and they had not been mining a mineral deposit. They had been performing surgery on a living deity without anesthesia, and now the patient was awake, and it was very, very angry. The creature filled the chamber, its body coiling around the drilling equipment and crushing it into scrap with the casual strength of a man crushing a paper cup, and it regarded Ronald with a focus that was almost familial, almost tender. It knew him. It had tasted his submission, had smelled his surrender, and it had marked him as different from the others. But the killing rage was still upon it, a fury that had been building for millennia and had been unleashed by the violation of the vein. And Ronald watched in numb horror as it turned its attention to the final remnants of the expedition that had dared to steal its blood. Thorn had not died immediately. The creature had kept him, toyed with him, dragged him through the water and into this chamber where the copper was thickest and the pain would be most acute. Ronald saw him now, clinging to a piece of floating debris in the far corner, his glasses gone, his face a mask of blood and seawater, his mouth opening and closing in silent screams that produced no sound above the churning of the water. The creature approached him with a slow, sinuous grace, its head weaving back and forth like a cobra mesmerizing a bird, and when it opened its mouth, the copper teeth parted to reveal a throat that glowed with the same internal fire as the eyes, a furnace that led down to the belly of the beast. Thorn looked at it, and for a moment his madness seemed to clear, and he saw what he was facing with the eyes of a man who had spent his life denying the existence of exactly this kind of wonder and terror. "It's beautiful," he whispered, the words barely audible above the water, and then the creature struck. It was not a bite. It was an inhalation, a suction so powerful that it pulled Thorn from his debris and into the creature's mouth without the teeth ever touching him, swallowed whole and alive into the furnace of the god's belly, his final scream echoing inside the copper throat for a long moment before it was silenced by the crushing pressure of the creature's gullet. Ronald watched the bulge that was Thorn travel down the length of the serpentine body, a lump of living prey being drawn into the coils, and he felt nothing. No pity, no horror, no fear, only a distant, dreamlike detachment, as if he were watching a film about someone else's life, someone else's death. The creature turned back to Ronald, and in its eyes he saw a question. Not a threat, not a promise, but a query and evaluation. Was he like Thorn? Was he a thing of hubris and denial to be consumed and forgotten? Or was he what he claimed to be, a creature of submission and surrender, an ant that had learned its place? Ronald answered not with words but with action. He let his body go limp in the water, floating on his back, his arms spread wide, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling of the chamber where the water was still rising, inch by inch, toward the upper decks. He offered no resistance. He showed no fear. He became water, became copper, became part of the lake itself, and he waited for the judgment to fall. The creature approached, its massive head hovering over him, its breath hot and metallic on his face, and he felt the teeth brush against his chest, not cutting but testing, pressing hard enough to leave red marks on his skin but not hard enough to break the surface. The antlers scraped against the wall behind him, sending showers of sparks into the water, and the creature made a sound that was almost a purr, a low, rumbling vibration that traveled through the water and into Ronald's bones, a sound of satisfaction, of acceptance, of a debt acknowledged if not forgiven. And then, with a flick of its massive tail that sent Ronald tumbling through the churning water, the creature withdrew. It sank back into the borehole, its body coiling down into the darkness, the copper light fading with it, until the chamber was dark and cold and silent except for the sound of the water rising and the distant, fading rumble of something massive moving through stone far below. Ronald floated alone in the dark, his lungs burning, his mind empty, and he knew that he had been spared not because he deserved to live but because he had been found unworthy of the creature's full attention. He was a messenger now, a witness, the sole survivor of an expedition that had challenged a god and been found wanting, and his life was no longer his own. It belonged to the deep, and the deep would collect its debt in its own time. He was found 3 days later, floating in a piece of wreckage that had once been the door of the main cabin, drifting in a current that should have carried him miles from the outpost, but had somehow deposited him within sight of the shipping lanes. The rescue crew that pulled him from the water was a Coast Guard cutter, responding to a distress signal that had been automatically triggered by the sinking of the barge, though the signal had been garbled and intermittent, as if something had been interfering with its transmission. They wrapped him in blankets and injected him with warm saline, and asked him questions that he could not answer, questions about the other members of the expedition, about the cause of the sinking, about the strange copper dust that coated his skin and his clothes, and seemed to resist all attempts at cleaning. Ronald said nothing. He sat in the infirmary of the cutter, staring at the wall, his eyes wide and unblinking, and he listened to the water against the hull with a terror that he could not express in words. The Coast Guard found the wreckage of the barge 2 days later, or what was left of it, a tangled mass of metal and wood that had been crushed and twisted by forces that the investigating officers described as consistent with a massive underwater explosion or impact. They found no bodies. They found the copper samples, or what remained of them, fused into a solid mass of metal that was harder than any alloy they had ever encountered. And they found the scale that Cortez had discovered, still embedded in the rock on the promontory, still sharp enough to draw blood from the diver who tried to extract it. The official report called it a tragic accident, a geological survey expedition lost to sudden weather and equipment failure, and Ethelgard Mining settled with the families of the deceased for amounts that were generous enough to ensure silence. Ronald was interviewed by corporate lawyers, by government officials, by journalists who wanted the story of the sole survivor, and he told them nothing. He signed a non-disclosure agreement for a sum that would keep him comfortable for life, and he disappeared. He did not go home to Michigan. He did not return to academia or to the field of geology. He changed his name, his address, his entire identity, and he moved to the desert, to the most arid, waterless place he could find, a town in Arizona where the annual rainfall was measured in fractions of an inch and the nearest body of water larger than a swimming pool was 200 miles away. He bought a small house on the edge of the desert, a cinder-block structure with thick walls and small windows and no plumbing that connected to any natural source, and he filled it with things that had nothing to do with water or copper or the Great Lakes. He worked odd jobs, construction mostly, manual labor that exhausted his body and left his mind too tired to dream. And he lived alone, without friends, without family, without any connection to the life he had lived before the expedition. The therapists he was forced to see diagnosed him with severe PTSD, with survivor's guilt, with dissociative disorders that made him unfit for normal society, and they prescribed medications that he took religiously, pills that dulled the terror and flattened the emotions, and turned his waking hours into a gray, featureless landscape that was almost, but not quite, peaceful. But the nights were different. The nights were when the lake came back. It started with the dreams. Dreams of water, black and cold and smelling of copper, dreams of eyes glowing in the fog, dreams of a voice that whispered his name in a language of teeth and scales. He would wake sweating, his heart racing, his hands clutching the sheets with a desperation that tore the fabric, and he would lie in the dark for hours, listening to the desert wind, trying to convince himself that he was safe, that the creature was 1,000 miles away, that it could not reach him here. But the dreams were only the beginning. Sounds came next. The distant, muffled roar that seemed to come from the plumbing, from the pipes that carried water to his house from the municipal supply. He would be sitting at the kitchen table, eating a meal that tasted like ash, and he would hear it. A low, wet, rattling sound that was not the pressure of the pipes or the gurgle of the drain, but the breathing of something enormous, something that had followed him across the continent, something that was reminding him of its presence with the patience of an immortal. He stopped using the tap. He bought bottled water, gallons of it, and he kept them stacked in the corner of his kitchen, and he never, ever looked at a glass of water for more than a few seconds at a time. Because if he really looked, he would see the ripples. Tiny, concentric circles that formed in the center of a perfectly still glass, expanding outward with a regular, rhythmic pulse that matched the heartbeat of the deep. He would sit in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests, his eyes fixed on the glass, and he would watch the ripples form and spread and fade, and he would hear the breathing and he would know. he would know that it had not let him go. It had simply let him leave. It had sent him away to tell the story, to spread the warning, to be a living testament to what happens to those who steal from the deep. And it was watching him, always watching, from the water in his pipes, from the moisture in the air, from the blood in his veins that was 60% liquid and therefore always connected to the lake. Years passed. The world forgot about Ethelgard mining and the lost expedition. The copper vein was never mined, the site declared geologically unstable and environmentally protected, and new technologies made the need for pure-source copper less urgent. Ronald grew old alone, his hair turning white, his body bending under the weight of labor and trauma, his mind a fortress of locked doors and dark rooms that he never allowed anyone to enter. He developed rituals to keep the creature at bay. He never touched copper. He avoided mirrors, afraid of seeing the reflection of eyes that were not his own. He slept with the lights on, though the darkness was not what he feared. It was what the darkness contained, the memory of a head rising from a borehole, of teeth that glowed with internal fire, of a voice that spoke in the language of stone and water. And every night, without fail, he would sit at his kitchen table with a glass of water in front of him, and he would watch for the ripples, watch for the signs, watch for the moment when the creature decided that his time as a messenger was over, that his debt was due, that the deep had finally come to collect what it had spared so long ago. The final image came on a night like any other, a dry, hot Arizona night when the wind carried the smell of sage and dust and nothing else. Ronald sat at his table, the glass of water before him, his eyes sunken and hollow in a face that had become a map of his suffering. He was 73 years old, and he had not spoken aloud in 10 years, not since the last therapist had given up on him and declared him a lost cause. The glass was still. The house was silent. The desert stretched away into the darkness beyond his windows, an ocean of sand that was the only waterless place he could find, the only refuge from the thing that had claimed the rest of his life. And then, as he watched, the ripple formed. Not in the center of the glass, where it usually began, but at the edge, a tiny distortion that traveled inward against the pull of gravity, against the laws of physics, against everything that Ronald understood about the nature of water. It moved slowly, deliberately, and as it reached the center, another formed and another, a series of concentric rings that pulsed with a rhythm he knew intimately, a rhythm that had been burned into his cells on a fog-shrouded lake so many years ago. The water in the glass began to glow, a faint, copper-colored luminescence that illuminated his face from below, casting his features in shades of orange and shadow. And from the faucet in the sink, from the pipes in the walls, from the very molecules of hydrogen and oxygen that surrounded him, he heard the sound. The roar. Not loud, not close, but present, undeniable, a sound that had traveled through the water table, through the aquifers, through the distant rivers that connected every body of water on the planet in a vast, living network. It was the sound of the Mishipeshu, the guardian of the copper veins, the god of the deep, and it was calling him home. Ronald did not scream. He did not run. He sat very still, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on the glowing water, and he felt the first warm trickle of liquid running from his nose. He touched his upper lip, and his fingers came away wet and copper-colored, smelling of the lake, of the vein, of the blood that he had spilled, and that had never been fully cleaned. He understood in that final moment that there was no escape, that the desert was not a barrier but a delay, that the creature had allowed him to run only so that his fear would mature, would deepen, would become a richer, more satisfying feast when the time came to collect. The debt was not paid. It had been accruing interest for decades, compounding in the currency of terror and guilt, and now the collector had arrived. The water in the glass was boiling now, though there was no heat, bubbles rising from the bottom and bursting at the surface with a sound like whispered names, and the glow was bright enough to hurt his eyes, bright enough to fill the room with copper light. Ronald closed his eyes. He bowed his head. He assumed the position of submission that had saved him once before, the posture of the ant before the giant, and he waited for the teeth, for the coils, for the endless dark. But the attack did not come. Instead, he felt a pressure against his mind, a presence that was not physical but psychic, a communication that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to the terrified animal in his hindbrain. The message was simple. It was not a threat. It was a promise. "I know where you are," it said, in a voice like stones grinding together at the bottom of the sea. "I have always known. Sleep now, little thief, sleep and remember. And when the water comes for you, as it comes for all things in time, I will be waiting." The pressure withdrew. The glow faded. The water in the glass went still and dark and ordinary. And Ronald opened his eyes to find himself alone in his kitchen, his face wet with tears or blood or lake water, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He lived. The creature had let him live again, had prolonged the debt for reasons that he could not fathom, and the terror of that mercy was worse than any quick death could have been. Because now he knew, with an absolute and crushing certainty, that every glass of water he would ever drink, every raindrop that fell on his roof, every dew-covered morning in the desert would be a reminder. The Mishipeshu did not forget. The Mishipeshu did not forgive. And the Mishipeshu was patient. It would wait for him to die of old age or disease or despair, and when his body was buried in the dry earth of Arizona, the water would come. The rains would return. The aquifers would rise. And somewhere in the deep, in the dark, in the veins of copper that ran through the bones of the world, the creature would feel his heart stop, and it would smile if such things could smile, and it would know that the debt was finally, irrevocably, paid in full. Ronald sat at his table until dawn, watching the glass of water, waiting for the ripples that never returned. And when the sun rose over the desert, he was still there, still kneeling, still waiting, an old man in a waterless place who had learned too late that there was no place on earth, no depth, no height, no distance that could outrun the long memory of the deep. The copper was patient, the lake was patient, and the Mishipeshu, guardian of veins, keeper of bones, god of the forbidden depths, had all the time in the world. The white lie. The swamp had no name on any map that the outsiders had brought with them, no designation in the geological surveys or the biological atlases or the corporate prospectuses that had funded their expedition. The locals called it simply the marsh, or sometimes the deep, or sometimes, in the whispered tones that suggested both reverence and fear, the white. Aaron had lived on its edge for 23 years, in a shack that he had built with his own hands from driftwood and salvaged tin and the bones of animals that had died in the mud. And he had watched the outsiders arrive with the same weary resignation that a man might watch a storm roll in from the sea, knowing that there was nothing to be done but to batten down the hatches and wait for the destruction to pass. They came in a single vehicle, a heavy-duty all-terrain truck that was painted the bright corporate blue of Apex Biological Solutions, the sponsor that had funded their research, and that expected, in return for its investment, proof of a theory that Aaron knew, with a certainty born of experience, was not merely wrong but dangerously, catastrophically naive. The theory was that the Alaskan tiger, the legendary white beast that haunted the marshes around Paxson, was not a supernatural entity but a biological one, a displaced Siberian tiger or a freak mutation of some known species, a creature that could be catalogued and classified and explained away by the rational machinery of modern science. The 4 biologists who emerged from the truck were young, eager, their faces glowing with the flush of ambition and the certainty of youth, and Aaron watched them from the window of his shack, his eyes sunken and hooded in a face that was weathered beyond its 50 years, and he felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation that he had learned to recognize as the marsh's warning, the deep's displeasure at the arrival of those who did not belong. He met them at the boundary, the invisible line that separated the solid ground of the forest from the deceptive, shifting terrain of the marsh, a line that Aaron had learned to identify through decades of proximity, a line that the outsiders blundered across without even knowing it existed. He stepped out from behind a stand of black spruce, his movements silent despite the snow that covered the ground, his rifle held loosely in one hand, not threatening but present, a reminder that this was not a place where visitors were welcomed. The leader of the group, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, stepped forward with her hand extended, her smile professional and warm, and she introduced herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no by the world. "Dr. Chen, Apex Biological Solutions," she said, her voice crisp and clear, cutting through the stillness of the frozen swamp like a knife. "We're here to conduct a survey of the local fauna. We were told you might be able to help us with navigation. The maps of this area are incomplete." Aaron looked at her hand, then at her face, then past her to the three young men who stood behind her, their equipment cases heavy with cameras and sensors and sampling gear, their eyes bright with the excitement of the frontier. He did not take her hand. He did not smile. He simply looked at them with an expression that was not hostile but was infinitely distant, the look of a man who has seen things that cannot be unseen, and who knows that the people before him are walking toward a death that they cannot imagine. "Turn around," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp that was barely louder than the wind in the spruce needles. "Go back to Paxson. Get on a plane. Go anywhere but here." Dr. Chen's smile faltered, but it did not break. She had dealt with hostile locals before, with indigenous populations that resented the intrusion of science, with hermits and eccentrics who had claimed ownership over lands that they did not understand. She was prepared for resistance, and she deployed the weapon that had always served her in such situations: patience, reason, and the subtle implication of authority. "Mister," she prompted, her hand still extended. "Just Aaron," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "And I'm not a local, I'm a survivor. There's a difference." The smile returned, brighter, more determined. "Aaron, then. We appreciate your concern, but we're fully equipped for the conditions. We have GPS, satellite communication, thermal imaging, and enough supplies for 2 weeks. We're not tourists. We're scientists. And we're here to prove that the so-called Alaskan tiger is a natural phenomenon, a mutation or a migration, something that can be explained without resorting to superstition." Aaron laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a dry, barking cough of a laugh that seemed to come from deep in his chest, a sound that contained no humor but only the bitter residue of experience. "The white is a lie," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more audible than his normal speech, a whisper that carried on the cold air with a clarity that made the biologists lean forward to hear it. "The more black it becomes, the hungrier it gets." Dr. Chen's smile finally broke, replaced by a frown of professional concern, the kind of frown that a doctor might wear when a patient begins to speak of delusions. "Mr. Aaron, I understand that the local folklore attaches significance to the coloration of the animal, but we're here to find facts, not myths. If you'll just let us pass, we can." "The stripes," Aaron interrupted, his voice rising slightly, his eyes flashing with an intensity that made the young men behind Chen shift their weight and exchange glances. "You think the stripes are markings, you think they're genetic, you're wrong. The stripes are a ledger, a count. Every kill makes a stripe, every stripe makes it darker, and the darker it gets, the more visible it becomes. The more visible it becomes, the more it needs to feed. It's not a tiger, it's not an animal. It's a ledger of death, and you're walking into its book." He stepped aside then, his gesture not one of invitation but of surrender, of a man who has delivered his warning and now absolves himself of responsibility. "Go on then," he said, "but don't say I didn't tell you. And when you see the white in the fog, don't run. Running makes it hungry. Stay still, stay quiet, and maybe, just maybe, you'll live long enough to understand how small you really are." He turned and walked back into the trees, his footsteps silent on the snow, and he did not look back. He had done what he could. The rest was up to them and to the marsh and to the thing that waited in the white. The biologists watched him go, and then they turned to each other and laughed, a nervous, braying sound that was meant to dispel the tension, but that only revealed their own unease. Dr. Chen was the first to recover, shaking off Aaron's words with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had built her career on dismissing the irrational. "Local color," she said to her team, her voice bright and dismissive. "Every expedition has them. The important thing is not to let it shake our focus. We're here for science, not ghost stories." She gestured to the equipment cases, and the young men, Mark, a graduate student in wildlife biology, James, a corporate photographer, and Peter, a field technician, began to unload the truck, their movements hurried, their eyes darting toward the tree line where Aaron had disappeared. The fourth member of the team, the corporate sponsor whose name was Richard Vance, remained in the truck, his face pressed to the window, his expression unreadable behind the glass. He was not a scientist. He was a businessman, a vice president of Apex who had authorized the expedition based on a cost-benefit analysis that suggested the discovery of a new large predator would generate publicity worth millions. He had not come to study the creature. He had come to own it, to brand it, to turn it into a commodity that could be sold to zoos and documentary filmmakers, and the endless, hungry maw of public fascination. He had not heard Aaron's warning, and even if he had, he would not have understood it. He understood balance sheets and profit margins and market share, and the concept of a predator that could not be bought or sold or explained was as alien to him as the surface of the moon. They established their base camp on a promontory of relatively solid ground that jutted out into the marsh like a finger pointing into the abyss. The promontory was covered in a thin layer of snow that concealed a treacherous underlayer of peat and permafrost, a deceptive crust that looked solid but that would crumble beneath the weight of a boot, plunging the unwary traveler into pools of black water that were as cold as liquid nitrogen and as bottomless as the grave. Aaron had warned them about the false ground, had told them that the marsh was a labyrinth of hidden sinkholes and thin ice over deep water, but they had dismissed his warnings as the ravings of a paranoid hermit, and they set up their tents and their equipment with the careless confidence of people who believed that technology could overcome any obstacle that nature might place in their path. The GPS, however, began to fail almost immediately. The satellites that should have provided pinpoint accuracy drifted and stuttered, their signals corrupted by the mineral composition of the swamp, a rich soup of iron and copper and magnesium that created electromagnetic anomalies strong enough to scramble the most sophisticated navigation equipment. The compasses spun wildly, the needles chasing each other in circles that suggested the magnetic poles had reversed. The radio, which should have connected them to the world beyond the marsh, emitted only a hissing static that sounded, to Mark's increasingly frayed nerves, almost like breathing. And the heavy equipment, the portable generators and the sampling drills and the camera traps that they had brought to document their quarry, began to sink. Not dramatically, not all at once, but inch by inch, the legs of the tripods and the frames of the generators settling into the peat with a slow, wet-swallowing sound that reminded James, the photographer, of quicksand in the movies he had watched as a child. Dr. Chen tried to maintain morale, but the marsh was working on them in ways that she could not quantify or control. The fog, which rolled in every afternoon with the reliability of a tide, was not white but gray, a thick, oppressive blanket that reduced visibility to 10 feet, and that seemed to muffle sound as well as light, creating a cocoon of silence that was broken only by the wet, sucking sounds of the marsh itself. The bubbles of methane that rose from the decomposing peat, the crack of ice forming and reforming on the hidden pools, the distant, indeterminate noises that might have been animals or might have been the wind or might have been something else entirely, something that had no name in the taxonomy of the known world. They slept in shifts, 2 awake and 2 asleep, a precaution that Chen had instituted after the first night, when Mark had woken to find his tent flap open and a set of massive, unfamiliar tracks in the snow outside, Tracks that were not the padded paws of a bear or the split hooves of a moose, but something else. Something that suggested a weight of 1,000 pounds distributed across feet that were neither feline nor canine, but a terrible amalgamation of both. The tracks led from the tree line to the edge of the promontory and then disappeared into the water, and when Chen measured them in the morning, she found that they were 18 inches across, with claw marks that extended another 6 inches beyond the pads, marks that were deep enough to score the frozen peat beneath the snow. "Large felid," she said, her voice tight with excitement that she could not entirely conceal. "Definitely a large felid. Possibly a liger or a very large Siberian. The size suggests a mutation, maybe something caused by the mineral content of the water. This is exactly what Apex is hoping for." But her words rang hollow in the fog, and the others looked at the tracks with expressions that were not scientific but primal, the expressions of animals who have smelled a predator and know, in the deepest parts of their brains, that they are outmatched. The geometry of the marsh was a horror in itself, a physical nightmare of terrain that seemed designed to disorient and trap. The biologists had brought topographical maps, satellite images, LiDAR scans that showed the contours of the land in exquisite detail, but none of these tools prepared them for the reality of moving through the marsh on foot. The paths that looked solid on the map turned out to be thin crusts of ice over bottomless mud. The streams that should have been shallow were channels of fast-moving black water that pulled at their boots with a current that was invisible until they stepped in. The trees, stunted black spruce and leafless willows, grew in patterns that defied natural distribution, clustered in groves that blocked the sun and created mazes of shadow where the fog pooled and thickened, forming pockets of visibility so low that they could not see their own hands in front of their faces. And the sounds. The sounds were the worst part because they were wrong. The marsh should have been alive with the sounds of birds and insects and small mammals, the ordinary symphony of a wetland ecosystem. But instead it was silent, a silence so profound that it seemed to press against their eardrums with a physical weight, broken only by the wet, organic noises that came from beneath their feet and from somewhere in the fog beyond. The slurp of mud, the crack of ice, the distant, rhythmic sound of something heavy moving through the water, a sound that was not quite swimming and not quite walking but something in between, a passage through the marsh that left no tracks and no wake but that was audible nonetheless, a presence that announced itself not by sight but by sound, by the displacement of air and water, and the terrible, patient rhythm of a predator that knew its territory intimately and knew that the intruders did not. Aaron watched them from his shack, a mile away through the trees, his eyes fixed on the promontory with binoculars that were older than most of the biologists. He could see their lights in the fog, the harsh, artificial glow of their electric lanterns that seemed to attract the mist rather than dispel it, and he could hear their voices, raised in argument and complaint and the brittle, desperate laughter of people who are trying to convince themselves that they are not afraid. He had seen this before. He had watched other expeditions arrive, other scientists and hunters and thrill-seekers who had come to prove the existence of the Alaskan tiger, to capture it or kill it or simply to see it, and he had watched them all leave, or not leave, depending on how the marsh chose to deal with them. Some had escaped with their lives, their sanity shattered, their careers ruined by reports that no one believed. Others had simply disappeared, their equipment found months later, rusted and broken, their bodies never recovered, their fates a mystery that the marsh kept close to its black heart. Aaron had been the only one to survive a direct encounter, 23 years ago, when he had been a young man not so different from Mark or James or Peter, full of confidence and arrogance, and the belief that the world was a knowable place that could be mastered with the right tools and the right attitude. He had learned otherwise. He had learned that the marsh was not a place but a presence, not an ecosystem but an organism, and that the creature that hunted its depths was not a tiger but something else, something that wore the shape of a tiger the way a man might wear a coat, something that used the white of the snow and the gray of the fog as camouflage not because it was hiding, but because it was hunting. Because the more invisible it was, the more successful its kills, and because the kills were not about food but about something else, something that Aaron had never fully understood but that he had learned to respect with a reverence that bordered on worship. He remembered the night of his own encounter with a clarity that time had not dimmed. He had been part of a team of 5, hunters and trappers who had come to the marsh with rifles and dogs, and the confidence of men who had faced bears and wolves and knew how to kill. They had seen the white in the fog, a flash of movement that was there and then gone, and they had pursued it, tracking it through the maze of pools and sinkholes with a determination that had bordered on obsession. They had not understood the geometry of the marsh, had not realized that the creature was herding them, directing them, using the terrain to separate them from each other and from their weapons and from any hope of escape. One by one, they had vanished. Not died, not been killed in any ordinary sense, but vanished, swallowed by the fog and the mud and the white silence that was the creature's domain. Aaron had been the last, cornered in a grove of black spruce, his rifle empty, his dogs dead, his companions gone, and he had faced the creature with nothing but his bare hands and his terror. And he had survived. Not by fighting, not by fleeing, but by understanding, by recognizing the pattern of its behavior, by realizing that the creature did not hunt for food, but for completion, for the filling of a ledger that was written not in ink but in stripes, in the black marks that appeared on its spine after each kill, marks that were not genetic but earned, not inherited but taken. Aaron had frozen, had made himself small and still and unworthy of attention, and the creature had regarded him with eyes that were not animal but something else, something that held a cold, alien intelligence, and it had turned away, not because it was merciful but because it was not yet time, because the ledger was not yet full, because Aaron's death would not complete the pattern but would only add a stroke that was premature. He had lived, but the living had been a curse in itself, because the creature had marked him, had tasted his fear, had registered his presence in its book, and it had left him alive as a reminder, a witness, a sentinel who would watch and wait and warn others, who would carry the knowledge of the stripes and the hunger and the geometry of the marsh to anyone foolish enough to enter. He was not a survivor, he was a message, and the message was, do not come here, do not look, do not believe that you can understand what you cannot even see. The biologists on the promontory did not understand this message, and even if they had, they would not have heeded it. They were committed now, invested, their equipment sinking into the peat, their GPS failing, their satellite phone useless, their only connection to the outside world a radio that emitted nothing but static and their own dwindling supply of optimism. Dr. Chen stood at the edge of the promontory on the third evening, her binoculars pressed to her eyes, scanning the fog for any sign of movement, any flash of white that might indicate the presence of their quarry. She saw nothing. The fog was impenetrable, a wall of gray that swallowed light and sound and hope with equal efficiency. But she heard something, a splash, not the gentle plink of a fish or the soft plop of a frog, but a heavy, deliberate displacement of water, a sound that suggested something massive had entered the marsh from the tree line, something that was moving with a purpose that was not natural, not animal, but directed, intelligent, aware. She lowered the binoculars and listened, her breath held, her heart hammering, and she heard the sound again, closer now, much closer, and then she saw it. A flash of white in the fog, a shape that was there and then gone, a glimpse of something that was the color of the snow and the fog and the sky, something that blended so perfectly with its surroundings that it was not invisible but unseeable, not hidden but absent, a presence that registered only as a flicker in the peripheral vision, a movement that the eye refused to track because the mind could not accept what it suggested. There, she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement and something else, something that she would not admit was fear. Did you see it? Mark, who stood beside her, nodded, his face pale, his hands shaking. I saw something, he said, but I don't know what it was. It was like the fog moved, like the fog had a shape. Chen smiled, a tight, professional smile that did not reach her eyes. "Thermal cameras tomorrow," she said, "and motion sensors, we'll get it. We'll prove it's real." But as she turned back toward the camp, she felt the eyes on her, 2 points of focus that seemed to burn through the fog and into her back, and she knew, with a certainty that she would not acknowledge until it was far too late, that the creature was not the one being hunted. It was the hunter, and they were the prey. That night Aaron sat in his shack with the door barred and the windows covered, his rifle across his knees, his ears straining for the sounds that he knew were coming. The marsh was quiet, quieter than usual, a silence that was not peaceful but pregnant, the silence of a held breath, of a predator crouching before the pounce. He knew what was happening. He could feel it in his bones, in the ache of old wounds that had never fully healed, in the primal, animal part of his brain that recognized the presence of the white even when his eyes could not see it. The expedition was in its final hours. The geometry of the marsh had done its work, isolating them, confusing them, making them slow and vulnerable and utterly dependent on a technology that had already failed them. The creature was circling, choosing, deciding which of them would be the first to fill its ledger, which of them would provide the next stripe, the next mark, the next step toward the darkness that was its ultimate goal. Aaron had tried to warn them. He had spoken the words that his own experience had taught him, the words that had been passed down from survivor to survivor in a chain of terror that stretched back generations. But they had not listened. They had laughed. They had called him a madman, a hermit, a superstitious fool who was afraid of the modern world. And now they would pay the price for their arrogance, the price that the marsh always exacted from those who did not respect its rules, who did not understand that the white was a lie, that the stripes were real, and that the hunger was older and more patient than any human ambition could ever be. He loaded his rifle with hands that were steady but cold, and he waited for the screams to begin. Because they would begin. They always began. And when they did, he would have a choice to make, a choice that he had made once before and that had defined his life ever since. To run, to hide, to save himself, or to intervene, to fight, to try to save those who had not deserved their fate but who had certainly earned it. The marsh did not care about justice. The marsh cared only about the ledger, the count, the stripes that covered the white and made the creature darker, hungrier, more visible, more lethal. And tonight, the ledger would turn another page. Tonight, the first of the outsiders would die. And Aaron, the shepherd of the beast, the sentinel of the marsh, would watch and listen and remember why he had sworn, 23 years ago, never to leave this place, never to turn his back on the white, never to let the stripes cover the entire beast and unleash upon the world a hunger that would not stop until every living thing had been counted, consumed, and forgotten. The first disappearance happened in the space between heartbeats, in the gap between one moment and the next that the human mind cannot perceive, but that the predator has evolved to exploit with a precision that is as beautiful as it is terrible. Mark had drawn the short straw for the midnight watch, a duty that rotated among the 4 biologists, and that no one wanted but that everyone accepted with the brittle cheerfulness of people who are pretending that their fear is not real. He had been sitting in the entrance of his tent, his thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his eyes scanning the fog with the night vision goggles that Chen had insisted were essential equipment, when he saw something. It was not a shape, not a form, not anything that his conscious mind could identify and catalog. It was a disturbance in the fog, a ripple in the gray uniformity that suggested movement without revealing its source, a passage through the mist that left no trail but that was nonetheless present, a pressure wave of displaced air that made the fine hairs on Mark's arms stand erect, and his heart skip a beat. He raised the goggles, peering into the infrared spectrum where heat signatures should have appeared as bright spots against the cold background, but there was nothing. The creature, if it was a creature, did not register on thermal imaging. It did not emit heat. It did not absorb it. It existed in a state of thermal neutrality that was as impossible as it was terrifying. a biological anomaly that suggested the creature was not warm-blooded in any sense that science understood, but something else, something that maintained its body temperature at the exact level of its surroundings, making it invisible not only to the eye, but to the most sophisticated detection equipment that Apex could provide. Mark should have called out. He should have woken the others, sounded the alarm, done anything other than what he did, which was to stand up and walk toward the disturbance, his feet moving without his conscious command, his body drawn forward by a curiosity that was not his own but that had been planted in his mind by something else, something that could manipulate perception, that could create interest where there should have been terror, that could lure prey toward the hunter with a subtlety that was more terrifying than any overt threat. He walked to the edge of the promontory, his boots crunching on the frozen peat, his breath clouding in the air, and he reached the place where the disturbance had been. There was nothing there, only fog, only silence, only the wet, organic smell of the marsh that seemed to have intensified, to have become thicker, more pungent, more alive. And then he felt it, a breath on the back of his neck. Hot and wet and smelling of copper and old blood. A breath that was not the wind but something else, something that was standing directly behind him, something that was so close that he could feel the heat of its body radiating against his back, something that was so large that its presence blocked the ambient light and cast him in a shadow that was deeper than the night. He tried to turn, he tried to run, but his body would not respond. His muscles were locked, paralyzed by a fear so primal that it bypassed his brain entirely and rooted him to the spot like a tree, and he felt the claws, those terrible, curved claws that were the size of hunting knives, close around his shoulders with a gentleness that was more obscene than any violence could have been. The claws did not pierce. They simply held, gripping him with a pressure that was firm but not painful, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. And Mark had a moment of absolute, crystalline clarity in which he understood that he was going to die, that his life was ending, that the ambition and the curiosity and the scientific certainty that had brought him to this place were about to be rendered meaningless by a predator that did not care about his PhD or his publications or his dreams of academic glory. And then the claws tightened just slightly, and Mark felt a sharp, bright pain in his chest, and the world went white. The scream that woke the camp was not Mark's. Mark had not screamed. The creature had taken him in silence, with an efficiency that was surgical, and the scream was James's, the photographer, who had woken to use the latrine and had seen, in the foggy darkness, a shape moving past his tent, a shape that was white and massive, and that carried in its jaws a body that was unmistakably human, a body that hung limp and silent with a head that lolled at an unnatural angle. James had screamed, and the scream had shattered the silence of the marsh like a hammer through glass. And then he had run, not toward the others but away from the shape, away from the fog, away from the thing that was moving through the camp with a casual, almost domesticated grace that suggested it was not afraid of them, that it had never been afraid of them, that their presence in its territory was an inconvenience rather than a threat. The others woke to the scream, to the confusion, to the pounding of James's feet as he ran into the fog without direction, without purpose, without any hope of escape. Chen was the first to emerge from her tent, her flashlight cutting a cone of yellow through the gray, and she saw the tracks. Massive, five-toed impressions in the snow, each 118 inches across, with claw marks that extended beyond the pads like the blades of ice skates, tracks that led from the tree line to the place where Mark's tent stood open and empty, and then back to the water, where they disappeared into the fog with a finality that suggested the creature had not merely walked into the marsh but had merged with it, had become part of the fog and the water and the night itself. She shone her light into the marsh, into the gray nothingness, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw it, the white. A flash of movement, a shape that was there and then gone, a glimpse of something that was the color of the snow but that was not snow, that was the color of the fog but that was not fog, that was a living, breathing, hunting thing that moved with a speed that defied its size, and a silence that defied its weight. And then it was gone, and the fog closed around the space where it had been, and Chen stood alone in the camp with her flashlight shaking in her hand, and her heart hammering against her ribs, and her scientific certainty lying in pieces around her feet like broken glass. They found Mark's tent empty, his sleeping bag undisturbed, his equipment intact, his boots still placed neatly by the entrance as if he had stepped out for a moment and would return shortly. But he did not return. They called his name into the fog, their voices cracking with fear, and the fog swallowed their words and gave back nothing but silence. They searched the perimeter, their flashlights creating crazy, jittering patterns in the gray, and they found the claw marks on the canvas of James's tent, 5 parallel slashes that had ripped through the heavy fabric as if it were tissue paper, slashes that were spaced in a pattern that suggested a hand, a paw, a grasping appendage that was not quite feline and not quite human, but something that combined the worst features of both. And they found the blood. Not much. Just a few drops, scattered on the snow near the edge of the promontory, already freezing into black beads that glistened in the flashlight beams like obsidian marbles. Chen collected the blood in a sample vial, her hands shaking so badly that she dropped the cap twice, and she told herself that this was evidence, that Mark had been injured, that they would find him, that he was alive, that the creature was an animal and animals did not hunt for sport but for food. And if Mark was food, then he was already dead, but if he was not food, then he might still be alive, might still be out there, might still be waiting for rescue. But she did not believe her own words. She had seen the shape in the fog. She had seen the size of it. She had seen the way it moved, not with the frantic, desperate energy of a predator that is afraid of its prey, but with the calm, deliberate confidence of a predator that knows its prey is already caught. And she had seen the tracks, the massive, impossible tracks that were too large for any known felid, too deep for any natural animal, too purposeful for any random encounter. This was not a displaced tiger. This was not a freak mutation. This was something else, something that Aaron had tried to warn them about, something that the locals had whispered about in the bars of Paxson, something that the corporate prospectuses and the scientific journals and the optimistic grant proposals had dismissed as folklore and superstition and the ignorance of backward minds. And now it was real. Now it was here. Now it had taken one of them, and the expedition was no longer a scientific venture but a survival exercise, a race against time and terror to escape the marsh before the creature decided to take another. They huddled in Chen's tent, the 3 remaining biologists and the corporate sponsor, their bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort that neither the tent nor each other could provide. James was in shock, his eyes wide and vacant, his body shaking with a violence that suggested he was on the verge of complete breakdown. He had seen the creature, seen it clearly in the flashlight beam as it passed his tent, and whatever he had seen had been so far beyond his capacity to process that his mind had simply shut down, retreating to a place where the horror could not reach him. He sat in the corner of the tent, wrapped in a thermal blanket, rocking back and forth, muttering the same words over and over. It's not white. It's not white. It's not white anymore. Chen tried to question him, tried to extract a description, a size, a behavior, anything that might help them understand what they were facing. But James only shook his head and repeated his mantra, his voice rising to a shriek and then falling to a whisper, an oscillation of terror that suggested he had seen something that had broken him in a way that could not be repaired. Peter, the field technician, was more composed but no less terrified. He sat with his back to the tent wall, his knife in his hand, his eyes fixed on the entrance flap as if expecting it to burst open at any moment, as if the creature might decide to finish what it had started and drag them all into the fog. Vance, the corporate sponsor, was the most outwardly calm, but his calm was the brittle, glassy composure of a man who was calculating the cost of failure, the impact on his career, the way he would explain this to the board of directors. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice flat and controlled. "We need to hike back to Paxson today, right now, before it gets dark. We can leave the equipment. We can come back with a military escort with proper weapons, with a team that knows how to handle large predators." Chen nodded, her mind racing, her scientific curiosity warring with her survival instinct in a battle that survival was rapidly winning. "Agreed," she said. "We pack what we can carry, we move fast, we stay together, and we don't stop for anything." But the marsh had other plans. They emerged from the tent into a world that had changed overnight, a world that was no longer merely foggy but actively hostile, a world in which the geometry that had confused them before had now become a labyrinth of impossible proportions. The paths that they had used to reach the promontory were gone, submerged beneath water that had risen during the night, or covered by snowdrifts that had shifted with a purpose that was not meteorological but malevolent. The trees had moved, or seemed to have moved, their positions altered so that the landmarks they had memorized no longer matched the reality before them. And the fog, the terrible, omnipresent fog, had thickened to the point of solidification, a wall of gray that reduced visibility to 5 feet, and that seemed to muffle sound as well as light, creating a cocoon of isolation in which each of them was alone even when they were touching each other, alone with their fear and their breath, and the terrible, patient silence that was the marsh's ultimate weapon. They walked in a line, Chen in the lead, Peter behind her, Vance supporting the broken James, their feet sinking into the peat with each step, their progress measured in inches rather than yards, their hearts hammering with a terror that grew with each passing moment. And then in the clearing they saw it. The revelation came not with a roar but with a presence, a weight in the fog that made the air feel heavier, that made breathing an effort, that made the simple act of standing upright a test of willpower. The fog parted, not dramatically but gradually, like a curtain being drawn back to reveal a stage, and they saw the creature in full for the first time. And they understood, with a clarity that transcended fear and entered the realm of religious awe, that everything they had believed about the Alaskan tiger was wrong. It was massive. That was the first impression, the overwhelming, mind-numbing realization of scale. It stood on all fours in the center of the clearing, its shoulders level with Chen's head, its body extending backward into the fog in a length that suggested it was not merely large but elongated, serpentine, a creature that had been stretched and pulled and distorted until it no longer resembled any known felid but had become something else, something that was part tiger and part snake and part nightmare. Its fur was white, but it was not the white of snow or of albinism. It was the white of bone, of ash, of the absence of color that suggested not purity but negation, a color that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, that made the fog around it seem gray by comparison. But it was not the size or the color that made them scream, that broke James's fragile sanity and sent Peter to his knees and made Vance, the unflappable corporate man, vomit into the snow. It was the stripes. 3 distinct, charcoal-black stripes ran down the creature's spine, from the base of its skull to the root of its tail, each one perfectly straight, perfectly parallel, perfectly defined, as if they had been painted on by an artist with a steady hand and a dark vision. But they were not paint. They were not markings. They were something else, something that seemed to move beneath the fur, to pulse with a rhythm that matched the creature's breathing, to glow with a faint, internal luminescence that suggested they were not on the surface of the skin but embedded in it, grown from it, part of it in a way that was biological and spiritual and utterly beyond comprehension. Chen stared at the stripes, her scientific mind struggling to categorize, to explain, to find a place in the taxonomy for what she was seeing, and then she understood. She understood the legend. She understood the truth. The creature did not have stripes. It earned them. Each stripe was a kill. Each stripe was a life taken, absorbed, recorded in the flesh of the beast in a ledger that was written not in ink but in darkness, in the black marks that appeared on the white canvas of the creature's hide and that could never be erased, never covered, never hidden. The stripes were a visual tally of its success, a living record of its hunger, and the more stripes it accumulated, the darker it became, the more visible, the more lethal, the more real. And now it had three lives, 3 souls, 3 entries in a book that had no end. The creature regarded them with eyes that were not the yellow of a tiger but the gray of the fog, eyes that seemed to contain no pupil, no iris, no retina, only a blank, empty whiteness that reflected nothing and revealed nothing. Eyes that were windows not to a soul, but to a void, to an absence that was more terrifying than any presence could have been. It did not growl. It did not roar. It simply stood there, its massive chest rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic breathing that sent plumes of vapor into the cold air, and it waited. Waited for them to run, waited for them to scream, waited for them to fulfill their role in the drama that it had been directing since the moment they set foot in the marsh, the drama of the hunt, the chase, the kill. And they did run. Peter was the first, his survival instinct overriding his reason, his legs pumping as he sprinted into the fog with a speed that was born of pure terror, his knife forgotten, his pack forgotten, everything forgotten except the need to put distance between himself and the thing that was standing in the clearing. Chen shouted after him, her voice cracking, but Peter did not hear or did not care, and he vanished into the fog with a speed that was impressive and futile. Because the creature did not chase him. It did not need to. It simply watched him go, its head turning to follow his progress, and then it returned its attention to those who remained, to Chen and Vance and the broken James, and it smiled. It was not a smile in any human sense, not a curling of the lips or a crinkling of the eyes, but a change in the set of its jaw, a slight parting of the teeth, a suggestion of pleasure that was not emotional but functional, the pleasure of a predator that has watched its prey separate itself into manageable pieces and knows that the hunt is going exactly according to plan. The geometry of the marsh was not random. It was designed. The paths, the fog, the confusion, the isolation, all of it was part of the creature's hunting strategy, a way of herding the prey into positions where they could be taken one by one, without fuss, without struggle, without any hope of escape. And Peter, by running, had just made himself the next entry in the ledger, the next stripe, the next black mark on the white. They heard the scream 10 minutes later, a high, keening wail that rose from somewhere in the fog to the east, and then was cut off with a suddenness that was more terrible than the scream itself. Chen fell to her knees, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with sobs that she could not control. Vance stood beside her, his face pale, his hands trembling, his corporate certainty shattered by the reality of a world that did not operate according to spreadsheets and quarterly reports. James had stopped rocking. He had gone completely still, his eyes open and staring at the creature that still stood in the clearing, watching them with its blank white eyes, and he spoke, his voice soft and dreamy and utterly devoid of fear. "It's beautiful," he said. "Don't you see? It's beautiful. The stripes are so black, so perfect, like brushstrokes, like calligraphy. It's writing a poem on its own back, and the ink is us." Chen looked at him, and she saw that his sanity was gone, burned away by the revelation, replaced by a kind of mad appreciation that was almost as terrifying as the creature itself. And the creature, as if understanding his words, or perhaps simply responding to the change in his energy, took a step forward. A single, deliberate step that brought it closer to them, close enough that they could smell it. A smell that was not the musk of an animal but the smell of the marsh itself, of rotting vegetation and freezing water and the copper tang of old blood, a smell that was the essence of the deep, the signature of the place that was not a habitat but a body, and the creature was not a resident but an organ, a part of the whole that could not be separated from its environment. Chen scrambled backward, pulling James with her, and Vance followed, the three of them retreating into the fog with a slowness that was dictated by their terror, their legs refusing to move faster than a shuffle, their minds refusing to accept that flight was possible, that escape was anything but a cruel joke. The creature watched them go, and it did not follow. It simply stood in the clearing, its stripes pulsing with a slow, satisfied rhythm, and it waited for them to realize what they had already begun to suspect: that there was no way out of the marsh, that the geometry had them trapped, and that the only question remaining was which of them would provide the next stripe, and which would be the last to die. Aaron heard the scream from his shack, a distant, attenuated sound that was barely audible above the wind, but that carried to his ears with a clarity that was born of long practice. He knew what it meant. The first kill had been made, the first entry in the ledger recorded, the first stripe earned. The expedition was now a cull, a thinning of the herd, and the creature would not stop until the count was complete or until something intervened to break the pattern. He loaded his rifle with hands that were steady but cold, and he checked his supplies: the flares, the chemical deterrents, the equipment that he had assembled over 2 decades of preparation for a moment that he had prayed would never come but that he had known in his bones was inevitable. He was not a hero. He was not a savior. He was a sentinel, a witness, a man who had made a deal with the marsh 23 years ago and who had been paying the price ever since. The deal was simple: he would stay, he would watch, he would warn, and in return the creature would not follow him to Paxson, would not extend its hunting grounds to include the town, would not add the townspeople to its ledger. But the deal had a condition. If outsiders came, if the warning was ignored, if the stripes began to multiply, then Aaron had a responsibility. Not to save the outsiders, they were already dead in ways that they did not yet understand, but to contain the damage, to prevent the creature from growing too dark, too visible, too hungry. Because if the stripes covered the entire beast, if the white became black, then the ledger would be complete, and the creature would be unleashed upon the world with a hunger that would not stop at the marsh, that would not stop at Paxson, that would not stop until every living thing had been counted and consumed. Aaron had seen the 3 stripes. He knew what they meant, and he knew that he could not allow a fourth. The time for watching was over. The time for waiting was over. The time for the shepherd to intervene had come, and the marsh would either accept his sacrifice or it would take them all. The retreat from the clearing was not a march but a crawl, a desperate, inching progression through terrain that seemed to conspire against them with every step. Chen had taken the lead by default, her scientific authority the only remaining structure in a world that had collapsed into chaos, and she moved through the fog with a caution that was born of the certain knowledge that the ground beneath her feet was not trustworthy, that the path that looked solid might be a crust of ice over a sinkhole deep enough to swallow a man whole, that the trees that offered the promise of shelter might be markers in a labyrinth that had no exit. Vance followed her, his hand gripping James's arm with a force that was bruising, dragging the broken photographer through the mud and the snow with a determination that was not compassion but self-interest, the corporate instinct to preserve assets even when the assets had lost all value. James moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes open and staring, his feet shuffling in a rhythm that matched no cadence but his own internal music, and he muttered continuously under his breath, a stream of consciousness that was part poetry and part prayer, and part the ravings of a man whose mind had been shattered by the sight of something that should not exist. "The stripes are calligraphy," he whispered, his voice carrying in the fog with a clarity that was unnerving. "The black on white, the ink on paper, the poem written in flesh. Each stroke is a word, each word is a life, and the poem is never finished. It just keeps growing, stanza by stanza, until the page is full and the book is closed and the library burns." Chen tried to silence him, to focus his attention on the practical necessities of survival, but James only smiled, a vague, empty smile that suggested he was already gone, already consumed, already part of the ledger in ways that his body had not yet caught up to. The sounds of the marsh were their constant companion, a symphony of wet, organic noises that seemed to come from all directions at once, making it impossible to tell where the danger lay. The slurp of mud as their boots sank and were pulled free, a sound like a mouth sucking on a bone. The crack of ice forming on hidden pools, a sound like teeth snapping shut. The distant, rhythmic dripping of water from the trees, a sound like a clock ticking down to an explosion. And beneath it all, always beneath it all, the silence. The terrible, profound silence of a predator that was not moving, not hunting, but waiting. The silence of the white, the absence of sound that was more terrifying than any noise could have been, because it suggested that the creature was listening, watching, evaluating, choosing the moment of its next strike with a patience that was older than human civilization. Chen strained her ears, trying to detect any sign of pursuit, any indication that the creature was following them through the fog, but there was nothing. Only the silence, only the waiting, only the knowledge growing with each step that the creature did not need to follow them because it already knew where they were going, because the marsh was its body and the fog was its breath, and every inch of ground they covered was ground that the creature had already claimed as its own. The false ground claimed Vance first, or almost claimed him. He had been walking in the middle of the group, his attention divided between the path ahead and the weight of James in his grip, when his right foot broke through a crust of ice and peat that had looked solid from above. He felt the ground give way beneath him, felt his leg plunge into freezing black water that was as cold as liquid nitrogen, and he screamed, a high, animal sound that was more surprise than pain, and he grabbed at Chen's pack with both hands, pulling her backward as she tried to keep her own balance on the treacherous surface. They went down together, a tangle of limbs and equipment, and Chen felt the water soaking through her clothes, the cold hitting her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and making her muscles seize in a spasm of shock. Vance was up to his waist in the hole, his face white, his hands clawing at the edges of the ice, trying to find purchase on something that would not crumble beneath his weight. Chen scrambled to her knees, ignoring the pain of the cold, and she grabbed his wrists, pulling with a strength that she did not know she possessed, and she dragged him out of the hole inch by inch, foot by foot, until he lay on the solid ground beside her, gasping and shivering, his pants soaked and already freezing to his legs in a shell of ice. They lay there for a moment, panting, their bodies pressed together for warmth that neither could provide, and Chen looked into Vance's eyes and saw the fear that she felt reflected back at her. The fear of a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes and who was now utterly at the mercy of forces that he could not comprehend, let alone control. "We're going to die here," Vance said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, the statement of a businessman who has read the balance sheet and found the numbers to be irrefutable. "We're going to die, and no one will ever know what happened to us." Chen wanted to argue, wanted to find the words of encouragement that leaders were supposed to provide in moments of crisis, but she could not, because Vance was right. The marsh was killing them, slowly and methodically, not with teeth and claws but with geography, with temperature, with the slow erosion of hope that came from walking in circles, from sinking in mud, from hearing the silence that was the creature's ultimate weapon. They pressed on, their progress measured in yards rather than miles, each step a negotiation with a terrain that seemed to shift and change beneath their feet. The fog thickened, became a physical substance that pressed against their faces and clogged their throats, making breathing an effort that required conscious thought. The temperature dropped, the cold seeping into their bones with a persistence that no amount of clothing could resist, and Chen felt her fingers going numb, her toes losing sensation, her mind slowing as hypothermia began its patient work of shutting down her peripheral functions. James had stopped muttering. He walked now in a silence that was more terrifying than his ravings, his eyes fixed on some point in the fog that only he could see, his body moving with a mechanical efficiency that suggested he was no longer in control of his own movements but was being directed by something else, something that was using him as a vessel, a conduit, a pointer toward a destination that was not escape but consumption. Vance dragged him, his own strength failing, his breath coming in ragged gasps that suggested he was on the verge of collapse, and Chen moved ahead, her eyes scanning the fog for any sign of the tree line, any indication that they were approaching the edge of the marsh, the boundary where the solid ground began and the nightmare ended. But there was no tree line. There was no boundary. There was only fog and mud, and the wet, sucking sounds of the marsh that seemed to grow louder with each step, as if they were walking not away from the danger but toward it, as if the marsh were a funnel that was narrowing around them, herding them into the deepest, darkest, most inescapable part of itself. And then from somewhere behind them they heard the sound, not the silence, not the waiting, but the movement, the wet, heavy sound of something large pushing through the underbrush, something that was not trying to be quiet, something that was making its presence known with a deliberation that was more terrifying than any stealth could have been. It was the sound of the creature, the white beast with the black stripes, and it was moving not quickly, not frantically, but with a steady, purposeful rhythm that suggested it knew exactly where they were going, and exactly how long it would take to reach them. Chen turned, her flashlight cutting a trembling arc through the fog, and she saw nothing. But she felt it. Felt the weight of its attention, the pressure of its gaze, the presence of something so large and so ancient that it seemed to bend the air around it, to create a gravity well of fear that pulled at her muscles and her mind and her will to live. "Run," she whispered, but the word was unnecessary. They were already running or trying to run, their feet sinking into the mud with each step, their bodies propelled by a terror that was beyond physical exhaustion, beyond hypothermia, beyond the limits of what they thought they could endure. They ran through the fog, Vance dragging James, Chen in the lead with her flashlight bobbing wildly, and they ran without direction, without purpose, without any hope that their flight would lead to safety. Because there was no safety. There was only the marsh and the creature and the slow, inevitable geometry of the hunt. Aaron found them 2 hours later, or what felt like 2 hours, though time had become as fluid and unreliable as the ground beneath their feet. He emerged from the fog like a ghost, his rifle in one hand, a flare in the other, his face a mask of determination that was etched deep into the weathered lines of his skin. He had been tracking them, following the signs that the creature left for him to find, the broken branches and the disturbed snow and the faint, almost imperceptible marks that suggested the creature was herding them, pushing them, directing them toward a destination that only it knew. He found Chen first, collapsed against a tree, her flashlight dead, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion, her eyes wide and staring at the fog with an expression that suggested she had seen something that had broken her in ways that would never heal. He knelt beside her, his movements slow and non-threatening, and he spoke to her in a voice that was soft and steady and utterly devoid of the panic that he felt in his own chest. "Dr. Chen," he said, "can you hear me?" She turned her head, her eyes focusing on him with an effort that was visible, and she nodded, a tiny, jerky movement that was all she could manage. "Aaron," she whispered, "the hermit." "Yes," he said, "the hermit, and I'm here to get you out, but I need you to do exactly what I say. No questions, no arguments. Just follow me and stay quiet, and maybe, just maybe, we'll live through this." He helped her to her feet, supporting her with an arm around her waist, and they moved through the fog together, following the trail that Aaron had memorized, a trail that existed only in his mind, a path through the marsh that he had learned over 2 decades of living on its edge, of watching its patterns, of understanding its moods. They found Vance and James 100 yards further on, huddled together in a grove of black spruce, their bodies pressed against each other for warmth that was not coming, their eyes hollow and empty, their minds as lost as their hope. Aaron looked at them, at the 4 outsiders who had come to the marsh with their science and their cameras and their corporate sponsorship, and he felt a wave of something that was not pity but recognition. He had been them once. He had been young and arrogant and certain of his own competence, and he had learned in the most brutal way possible that the marsh did not care about science, about technology, about the bright lights of human ambition. The marsh cared only about the ledger, the count, the stripes that covered the white and made the creature hungrier, darker, more visible, more lethal. And now these four, or what remained of them, were entries in that ledger. And Aaron's job was not to save them but to limit the damage, to prevent the count from growing too high, to keep the creature from completing its pattern and unleashing a hunger that would not stop at the marsh but would extend to Paxson, to the world, to everything. He brought them to his shack, a journey that took hours and that was accomplished in a silence so profound that it seemed to be enforced by the marsh itself, a silence that was the condition of their passage, the price that Aaron had negotiated for their temporary safety. The creature watched them go, he knew. He could feel its eyes on them, its presence in the fog, its hunger a palpable weight that pressed against his back and made his spine ache with the effort of not turning around, not looking back, not giving it the satisfaction of his fear. But it did not attack. It let them go, let them reach the shack, let them collapse inside with a patience that was more terrible than any violence could have been. Because the creature knew, as Aaron knew, that the shack was not a sanctuary. It was a delay, a postponement, a brief respite in a hunt that would not end until the ledger was complete or until the shepherd found a way to break the pattern. Aaron built a fire in the rusted stove, his hands moving with the automatic precision of long practice, and he wrapped the survivors in blankets that were old and thin but better than nothing, and he gave them water that he had drawn from a well that was deep enough to be free of the marsh's taint, and he watched them drink and shiver and slowly, gradually, return to something resembling consciousness. And then he told them. He told them about the stripes. He told them about the ledger. He told them about the survivor's burden, the weight of being the one who lived when others died, the guilt that was not rational but was real, the knowledge that their survival was not a matter of merit or luck, but of the creature's choice, of the creature's whim, of the creature's patient calculation of how best to fill its book. He told them about his own encounter, 23 years ago, about the team of 5 that had been reduced to 1, about the way the creature had looked at him with eyes that were not animal but something else, something that held a cold, alien intelligence, and had turned away, not because he was worthy of mercy, but because he was not yet worth the kill. He told them about the deal, the unspoken bargain that he had made with the marsh, the role that he had accepted as the sentinel, the shepherd, the man who stayed to watch and warn and prevent the creature from growing too dark, too hungry, too real. And he told them about the cost of isolation, the cost of paranoia, the cost of living every day with the knowledge that the creature was out there, waiting, watching, counting the days until the stripes covered the white and the hunger was unleashed upon the world. Chen listened to him with a detachment that was born of exhaustion and shock, her scientific mind trying to find a framework for what he was saying, a way to fit the supernatural into the natural, the impossible into the possible. But she could not. The stripes were not genetic. The ledger was not metaphorical. The creature was not a tiger, not a mutation, not anything that could be explained by the taxonomy of the known world. It was something else, something that existed in the space between the categories, in the gaps of human understanding, and Aaron's words were not an explanation but a description, a mapping of a territory that could not be explained but could only be experienced. "Why did you stay?" she asked, her voice a whisper that was barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you run as far as you could, go to the cities, forget about this place?" Aaron looked at her, and his eyes were old, older than his years, older than the shack, older than the marsh itself. "Because I tried," he said. 20 years ago, I tried to leave. I packed my things and I walked to Paxson and I got on a bus and I rode for 3 days and I thought I was free. I thought the marsh was behind me, that the creature had forgotten me, that I could start a new life somewhere else, be someone else, forget about the stripes and the hunger and the white. He paused, his hands trembling around the mug of tea that he held for warmth. But it followed me, not physically. not in a way that anyone else could see, but in my dreams, in the shadows at the edge of my vision, in the sound of water running through pipes, in the smell of wet earth after rain, in the white of a snowfall that reminded me of the fog. It was always there, always watching, always waiting. And I realized that I couldn't escape because the escape was the trap. If I ran, if I left the marsh unguarded, the creature would follow the trail of the one who got away. It would extend its hunting grounds. It would add Paxson to the ledger. And the stripes would cover the entire beast, and the white would become black, and the hunger would be unleashed upon the world. He looked at her, and his eyes were pleading, begging her to understand. I don't stay to protect the world from the tiger. I stay because I believe that if I leave, the tiger will follow me, and the stripes will cover everything. The fire burned low, and the survivors huddled together in the shack, their bodies pressed against each other for warmth and comfort that neither the fire nor the blankets could provide. Aaron sat apart from them, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the sound that he knew would come, the sound of the creature testing the boundaries of the deal, probing the edges of the pattern, looking for a weakness in the shepherd's vigilance. And it would come. He knew it would come, because the creature was not satisfied with 3 stripes. 3 was a beginning. 3 was an appetizer. The creature wanted more. It wanted the complete set, the full ledger, the darkness that would cover the white and make it whole. And Aaron, the survivor, the sentinel, the shepherd of the beast, was the only thing standing between it and the feast that it craved. He loaded his rifle with hands that were steady but cold, and he checked his flares, and he waited for the dawn, knowing that the dawn would bring no safety, no rescue, no end to the hunt. The dawn would only bring clearer visibility, a better view of the geometry that trapped them, and the knowledge that the creature was still out there, still watching, still counting the hours until the next kill. The survivor's burden was not the memory of death. It was the expectation of it, the knowledge that every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of relative peace was a gift that could be revoked at any time, by any ripple in the water, by any shadow in the fog, by any distant, muffled sound that might drift across the years to remind him of the debt he still owed to the deep. Aaron sat in his shack, with the outsiders huddled around his fire, and he listened to the marsh. And the marsh listened back. The dawn that broke over the marsh was not a sunrise but a pale, sickly diffusion of gray light through the fog, a dimming of the darkness rather than an arrival of illumination, a transition from one kind of night to another that offered no warmth and no hope, and no indication that the world beyond the marsh still existed. Aaron had not slept. He had sat through the hours of false darkness with his rifle across his knees and his eyes fixed on the door of the shack, listening to the sounds that the marsh made in the deepest part of the night, the sounds that were not the ordinary noises of a wetland, but the communications of an organism that was aware, alert, and hungry. He heard the creature moving, not close but present, a pressure in the fog that translated into sound, a displacement of air that created ripples in the silence, a presence that was as much felt as heard. It was circling the shack, testing the boundaries of the deal, probing the edges of Aaron's vigilance with a patience that was older than the forest and more enduring than the mountains. And Aaron knew, with a certainty that had been forged in the fire of his own survival, that the deal was about to be tested in earnest. The creature had 3 stripes. It wanted a 4th. And the 4th was not going to be Aaron because Aaron was already marked, already counted, already part of the ledger in ways that made him inedible, unworthy, a page that had been turned but not consumed. The 4th would have to be one of the outsiders. One of the 3 huddled in the corner of the shack, wrapped in blankets and shivering with a fear that had become their permanent condition. And Aaron's job, his sacred, terrible duty, was to prevent that 4th stripe from being earned, to break the pattern before it could complete itself, to drive the creature back into the deep with a violence that would not kill it, because it could not be killed, but would confuse it, delay it, make it reconsider the cost of its hunger. He woke them with a roughness that was born of urgency, not cruelty, shaking Chen and Vance and James from their fitful sleep with an urgency that suggested the time for rest was over. "Get up," he said, his voice a rasp that cut through the silence like a knife. "Get your things, we're moving." Chen looked at him with eyes that were hollow and red-rimmed, her face pale and drawn, her body still shivering despite the fire that Aaron had kept burning through the night. "Moving where?" she asked, her voice a croak that barely carried. "The marsh is everywhere, there's nowhere to go." Aaron shook his head, his movements sharp and precise. "We're not running from the marsh, we're running through it. There's a path, a real path that leads to Paxson. It's not on any map. It's not something you can find with GPS or logic. It's something you can only find if you know where to look, if you understand the geometry, if you can read the signs that the marsh doesn't want you to read." He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes hard and unyielding. "But the path is narrow, and the creature is waiting. And if we're going to make it, we need to move fast, and we need to move together, and we need to do exactly what I say when I say it, without question and without hesitation. Because if you hesitate, if you question, if you fall behind, the marsh will take you. And I won't stop to save you. I can't. My job is to get as many of you out as possible, not to die trying to save the ones who can't keep up." Vance nodded, his corporate mind responding to the clarity of command even in the midst of his terror. James did not respond. He simply stared at the wall, his eyes vacant, his mind gone to a place where the marsh could not reach him. Aaron looked at him, and he knew that James was already lost, already a ghost walking, already part of the creature's ledger in ways that his body had not yet acknowledged. But he would take him anyway, because the shepherd did not choose his flock. The shepherd simply guided them and hoped that the wolves would be satisfied with what they had already taken. They emerged from the shack into a world that had changed overnight, a world that was no longer merely foggy but actively hostile, a world in which the very air seemed to resist their passage, to press against them with a weight that made walking an effort of will. Aaron led them in a line, Chen behind him, Vance supporting James, their feet sinking into the snow and the mud with each step, their progress measured in inches rather than yards. The path that Aaron followed was not a path in any ordinary sense, not a trail or a track or a way through the underbrush, but a series of markers that he had learned to read over 2 decades of proximity to the marsh, a language of bent twigs and disturbed moss and the faint, almost imperceptible signs that suggested solid ground beneath the deceptive crust of ice and peat. He moved with a speed that was surprising for a man of his age, his body bent forward, his eyes scanning the terrain with a focus that was absolute, his rifle held in one hand and his other hand trailing behind him to guide Chen, to keep her connected, to prevent the line from breaking. Because if the line broke, if anyone fell behind, if the fog separated them for even a moment, the creature would be there, waiting, ready to take the straggler with a speed that would be too fast to see and too final to escape. They walked for an hour, maybe 2, time losing its meaning in the gray uniformity of the fog, and Aaron felt the presence of the creature growing stronger, closer, more focused. It knew they were moving. It knew they were trying to escape, and it was not going to let them go without a fight. The first attack came without warning, a sudden eruption of white from the fog that was so fast, so silent, that Aaron barely had time to react. He saw a flash of movement to his left, a shape that was the color of the fog and the snow and the sky, a shape that was there and then gone in the space between heartbeats, and he threw himself to the side, knocking Chen to the ground with a shoulder block that sent them both tumbling into a snowbank. Vance screamed, a high animal sound, and Aaron looked up to see the creature standing 10 feet away, its massive body blocking the path, its blank white eyes fixed on them with a focus that was absolute and terrible. It was larger than he remembered, or perhaps it was simply closer, close enough that he could see the individual hairs of its white fur, the texture of its skin, the way its muscles moved beneath the surface with a fluidity that was more serpentine than feline. And he could see the stripes, the 3 black stripes that ran down its spine, each one a mark of a kill, each one a stroke in the ledger of death, each one pulsing with a faint internal luminescence that suggested they were not merely pigment but something else, something that was alive, aware, hungry for more. The creature did not growl. It did not roar. It simply stood there, its chest rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic breathing that sent plumes of vapor into the cold air, and it waited. Waited for them to run. Waited for them to break. Waited for them to fulfill their role in the pattern that it had established, the pattern of the hunt, the chase, the kill. Aaron did not run. He stood up, his body shaking with cold and fear, and he raised his rifle, not to fire but to aim, the barrel tracking the creature's head with a steadiness that he did not feel. "Stay behind me," he said to the others, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his heart. "Don't move, don't scream, don't breathe." The creature watched him, its head tilting to one side in a gesture that was almost curious, almost amused, and Aaron knew that it recognized him. It remembered him. 23 years ago, it had looked at him with those blank white eyes and had turned away, had let him live, had marked him as a witness rather than a victim. And now it was looking at him again, evaluating him, deciding whether his role had changed, whether he was still the shepherd or whether he had become the sheep. Aaron felt the weight of that evaluation, the pressure of the creature's attention, and he knew that this was the moment, the test, the trial that would determine whether the deal held or whether the creature would decide that the ledger was incomplete, that the shepherd was no longer useful, that the time had come to add a fourth stripe and move closer to the darkness that would cover the white. He lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately, and he reached into his pack with his other hand, his fingers finding the flare, the chemical deterrent, the tools that he had prepared for exactly this moment. The creature watched him, its body tensing, its muscles coiling beneath the white fur, and Aaron knew that it was preparing to strike, that the evaluation was over, that the verdict had been reached. He pulled the flare from his pack, his thumb finding the ignition switch, and he raised it above his head and he fired. The flare exploded into the fog with a sound like a thunderclap, a blinding burst of magnesium light that turned the gray world white, then red, then a searing, burning orange that seemed to penetrate the fog and illuminate the marsh for miles in every direction. The creature recoiled, its massive body twisting away from the light with a speed that was astonishing, and it let out a sound that was not a roar but a scream, a high, keening wail that was more like the sound of tearing metal than anything biological, a sound that suggested the light was hurting it, burning it, driving it back into the darkness where it belonged. Aaron did not hesitate. He threw the chemical deterrent, a canister of compressed gas that he had filled with a mixture of sulfur and pepper extract and other compounds that were designed to irritate the mucous membranes of large predators, and it exploded at the creature's feet, sending up a cloud of acrid, stinging vapor that made Aaron's eyes water and his throat burn even from 10 feet away. The creature staggered, its paws scrambling for purchase on the icy ground, its head shaking from side to side in a gesture of confusion and pain, and Aaron fired a second flare, then a third, creating a wall of light and smoke between the creature and the survivors, a barrier that would not hold for long but that might, just might, be enough to break the pattern, to confuse the hunt, to make the creature reconsider whether the fourth stripe was worth the cost. "Run!" Aaron screamed, his voice raw and ragged. "Run now, don't look back, just run." Chen scrambled to her feet, dragging Vance with her, and they stumbled forward into the fog, away from the light, away from the creature, away from the marsh and toward a solid ground that might not exist but that they had to believe in because the alternative was the teeth and the claws and the black stripes that pulsed with a hunger that would never be satisfied. Aaron did not run. He stood his ground, the flares burning in his hands, the chemical deterrent hissing at his feet, his eyes fixed on the creature that was retreating slowly, reluctantly into the deeper fog, its white fur stained with the orange light, its blank eyes fixed on him with an expression that was not anger but something else, something that looked almost like respect. It was not defeated. It was not driven away. It was simply delayed, confused, its pattern broken by a violence that it had not expected from the shepherd who had always been passive, always been watchful, never been a threat. And as it withdrew, as its massive body dissolved into the fog and the gray and the silence, Aaron saw the stripes. He saw them clearly for the first time in 23 years, saw the 3 black marks that ran down its spine, and he saw something else. A 4th stripe. Faint, barely visible, a smudge of darkness that was forming between the 3rd stripe and the tail, a new entry in the ledger that was not yet complete but that was growing, expanding, darkening with each passing moment. The creature had not killed on the promontory. It had not taken Aaron or Chen or Vance or James in the direct attack, but it had killed. Somewhere in the fog in the marsh, in the deep black water that covered the secrets of the swamp, it had taken something, someone, and the 4th stripe was the evidence, the record, the mark that could not be erased. Peter, the field technician who had run from the clearing, who had vanished into the fog, who had been the first to break and the first to be herded into the depths where the creature's hunger was most acute. Peter had provided the 4th stripe, and now the beast was darker, more visible, more lethal, and the shepherd's intervention had come too late to prevent the ledger from growing, too late to stop the pattern from advancing, too late to do anything but delay the inevitable. Aaron lowered the flares, his hands shaking, his body spent, his mind a whirlwind of exhaustion and despair. He had failed. Not in the immediate sense. He had saved Chen and Vance and James, had driven the creature back, had bought them time to reach the edge of the marsh to find the path to escape the geometry of the hunt. But he had failed in the larger sense, the sense that mattered, the sense that had defined his life for 2 decades. The creature had earned another stripe. The white was less white, the black was more black, and the hunger was growing, deepening, becoming more focused and more terrible with each kill. He stood in the fog, alone, the flares dying in his hands, the chemical deterrent dissipating into the cold air, and he listened to the silence that followed the creature's withdrawal. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a waiting silence, a silence that said with perfect clarity that the creature had not given up, that it was simply regrouping, reassessing, preparing for the next phase of the hunt. And the next phase would be worse, because now it knew him. Now it knew that the shepherd could fight, that the witness could become a threat, that the deal was not immutable and could be broken by a man with a flare and a can of chemicals and a desperation that was born of 23 years of waiting. The creature would remember, the creature would adapt, and the next time the flares would not be enough. The chemicals would not be enough. Nothing would be enough except the ultimate sacrifice, the final entry in the ledger, the stripe that would cover the shepherd himself and complete the pattern in a way that would either save the world or destroy it. He found the survivors at the edge of the marsh, collapsed against a tree that marked the boundary between the swamp and the forest, the place where the solid ground began and the nightmare ended. Chen was conscious, barely, her body shaking with hypothermia and shock, her eyes wide and staring at the trees as if she expected them to transform into something else at any moment. Vance was kneeling beside James, who had finally stopped breathing, his body cold and stiff, his face frozen in an expression of peaceful vacancy that suggested his final moments had been free of fear, free of pain, free of the marsh and the creature and the ledger that had consumed his sanity long before it consumed his life. Aaron looked at James, at the empty shell that had once been a man, and he felt a grief that was not personal but universal, the grief of a shepherd who has lost one of his flock, who has failed to protect the weak from the wolf, who has been reminded once again that his vigilance was not enough, that his sacrifice was not enough, that the creature would always take what it wanted, and the shepherd would always be left to count the cost. "He's gone," Vance said, his voice flat and empty, the voice of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. He just stopped, in the fog. He stopped walking and he sat down and he closed his eyes, and he didn't open them again. Aaron nodded, his movements mechanical, his mind already moving to the practical necessities of survival, of escape, of the journey to Paxson that would take them away from the marsh and into the world of the living where the creature could not follow, would not follow, must not follow. "Leave him," he said, his voice harsh with exhaustion. "We can't carry him, and the marsh will take him. It's what it wants." Another entry, another stroke in the ledger. Chen looked at him with an expression that was not accusation but understanding, the understanding of a woman who had seen the stripes and knew that the creature did not discriminate between the living and the dead, that all flesh was food, all life was ink, and the poem of the beast was written in the substance of the world itself. They walked to Paxson in a silence that was broken only by the crunch of snow and the rasp of their own breathing, a journey that took hours and that seemed to span years, a passage through the forest that was as much spiritual as physical, a pilgrimage from the domain of the creature to the domain of the human, from the ledger of death to the ledger of the ordinary. Aaron led them, his rifle in his hand, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of pursuit, any indication that the creature had decided to extend its hunting grounds beyond the marsh, to follow the trail of the ones who had escaped, to add the shepherd and his flock to the count that was never complete. But there was nothing, only the forest, only the snow, only the distant, indifferent sky that watched their passage with the same cold, empty gaze that the creature had fixed upon them in the clearing. They reached Paxson at dusk, a small cluster of buildings that seemed impossibly bright and warm and safe after the gray horror of the marsh. And they were met by the townspeople, who looked at their faces and their clothes and their hollow eyes and knew, without being told, that another expedition had failed, that the marsh had claimed its due, that the white lie had been exposed and the truth was darker than any of them had imagined. Chen and Vance were taken to the clinic, wrapped in blankets, given hot drinks and sedatives, and the gentle, practiced care of a community that had seen this before, that had watched the outsiders come and go, that had learned not to ask questions because the answers were always the same. Aaron stood apart from them in the street outside the clinic, his rifle still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the road that led back to the marsh, and he knew that he could not stay. He could not sleep in a warm bed, could not eat a hot meal, could not pretend that the world was sane and orderly and safe from the hunger that was growing in the deep, because the creature was still there. The ledger was still open, and the shepherd's work was not done. He walked back to the marsh that night, not because he wanted to, but because he had to, because the deal that he had made 23 years ago was not a one-time bargain but a lifelong commitment, a bond that could not be broken by distance or time or the comforts of civilization. He walked through the forest with a speed that was born of urgency, his feet finding the path without thought, his body moving with an automatic precision that suggested he was not walking but being pulled, drawn back to the edge of the swamp by a force that was not physical but psychic, a tether that connected him to the creature and the marsh and the ledger in ways that he could not explain but could not deny. He reached his shack as the moon rose, a pale, cold eye that watched his return with an expression that was not welcoming but expectant, as if the marsh had been waiting for him, as if the creature had known he would come back, as if the deal had always included this moment, this return, this acceptance of a role that was not chosen but assigned, not wanted but necessary. He entered the shack, his body aching, his mind numb, his spirit broken but not destroyed, and he sat by the cold stove with his rifle across his knees and he waited for the dawn, waited for the fog, waited for the sounds of the marsh that would tell him where the creature was, what it was doing, how close it was to the next kill. And as he waited, he felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation that had become his constant companion, the physical manifestation of the survivor's burden, the guilt that was not rational but was real, the knowledge that he had lived when others had died, and that his life was not a gift but a debt that was being paid in vigilance and isolation, and the endless, sleepless watching that would continue until the marsh decided that his service was no longer required, until the creature decided that the shepherd had become the sheep, until the ledger turned its final page, and the stripes covered the white, and the hunger was either satisfied or unleashed upon the world. The days that followed were a blur of routine and terror, a cycle of marking and watching and listening that became Aaron's entire existence. He spent his mornings walking the boundary of the marsh, his boots crunching on the frozen peat, his eyes scanning the fog for any sign of the creature, any indication that it was moving, hunting, preparing for the next phase of its eternal campaign. He marked the trails that led into the swamp, not with signs or warnings that would be ignored by the curious and the arrogant, but with subtle indications that only those who knew what to look for would see. Broken twigs arranged in patterns that suggested danger, stones placed in configurations that spoke of death, scratches on the trees that were not the marks of animals, but the marks of a man who had learned to communicate with the marsh in a language that had no words. He hoped that these marks would be enough to warn the next expedition, the next group of scientists or hunters or thrill-seekers who came to the marsh with their cameras and their theories and their belief that the world was a knowable place. But he knew that they would not be enough. They never were. The human capacity for self-deception was infinite, and the allure of the unknown was stronger than any warning, any sign, any testimony of a broken man who had seen too much and could not forget. They would come, they would enter, they would die, and Aaron would watch and he would count the stripes, and he would wait for the day when the ledger was full and the creature was complete, and the shepherd's vigilance was no longer enough to hold back the hunger that was older than the mountains and more patient than the sea. The nights were the worst. The nights were when the creature hunted, when the fog thickened, when the silence became a presence that pressed against Aaron's shack with a weight that made sleep impossible. He would sit by the window, his rifle in his lap, his eyes fixed on the white wall of fog that pressed against the glass, and he would listen. Listen for the sounds of the marsh, the wet, organic noises that were the creature's vocabulary, the language of hunger and pursuit, and the slow, inevitable consumption of the living by the dead. He would hear the splashes, the cracks, the distant, muffled screams that carried across the water with a clarity that was not natural, not physical, but psychic, a transmission of terror that bypassed the ears and lodged directly in the hindbrain, a reminder that the creature was always there, always hunting, always adding to the ledger in ways that Aaron could not prevent and could not escape. And sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, he would hear the breathing, the wet, rattling inhalation that was the creature's signature, the sound of something enormous taking in the scent of the world, tasting the air for prey, evaluating the shepherd's vigilance with a patience that was infinite and a hunger that was eternal. He would hear that breathing, and he would know that the creature was close, that it was watching his shack, that it was testing the boundaries of the deal, probing for weakness, waiting for the moment when Aaron's guard would drop, when his strength would fail, when his vigilance would falter and the door would open and the fourth stripe would become the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, until the white was completely covered and the beast was fully revealed in all its dark, terrible glory. But the door did not open. The vigilance did not falter. The shepherd remained at his post, night after night, year after year, a living barrier between the marsh and the world, a human dam that held back a flood that would otherwise consume everything in its path. Aaron grew old in his shack, his body bending under the weight of his duty, his face weathering into a mask of exhaustion and determination, his eyes sinking into hollows that were deeper than any physical fatigue could explain. He ate what he could catch or grow, fish from the streams that were not part of the marsh, vegetables from a garden that he tended with the same care that he devoted to his patrols, a small patch of earth that was his only connection to the world of the living, the only reminder that there was a life beyond the fog, beyond the ledger, beyond the endless watching that consumed his days and his nights and his soul. He had no friends. He had no family. He had no visitors except the occasional lost traveler or curious scientist who stumbled upon his shack and who he warned away with the same words that he had used with Chen and her team, the same prophecy of doom that was always ignored, always dismissed, always proven true in the end. He was alone, and the aloneness was not a burden but a necessity, the price of the deal, the cost of being the one who got away, the shepherd who stayed behind to watch the flock while the wolf circled in the fog, waiting for the moment when the shepherd would finally, inevitably, fall. The final image came on a night that was like any other, a cold, gray night when the fog was thick and the silence was deep, and the breathing of the creature was a constant presence in the air around the shack. Aaron sat by the window, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the white wall of fog, and he felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation that had become his constant companion, the physical manifestation of the survivor's burden. But tonight, the tightening was different. Tonight, it was accompanied by a warmth, a spreading sensation in his chest that was not pain but release, not fear but acceptance. He looked down at his hands, at the hands that had held the rifle for 23 years, that had fired the flares and thrown the chemicals and marked the trails and warned the travelers, and he saw that they were steady. Steadier than they had been in years, steadier than they had ever been, and he understood with a clarity that transcended thought and entered the realm of pure knowing that the end was near. Not the end of the creature which would outlive him by millennia, but the end of his vigilance, his service, his role as the shepherd of the beast. He was dying. Not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, peacefully, the way an old tree dies slowly from the inside out, its rings recording the passage of years in a language that only the forest can read. And the creature knew. He could feel it in the fog, in the breathing, in the weight of attention that pressed against the shack with a new intensity, a new focus, a new patience that suggested the waiting was almost over. The shepherd was failing. The shepherd was falling, and the wolf was preparing to enter the fold. Aaron stood up, his movements slow but deliberate, and he walked to the door of the shack. He unbarred it, his hands steady, his heart calm, and he stepped out into the fog, into the marsh, into the white that was the lie and the truth and the everything that had defined his existence for half a lifetime. The fog closed around him, thick and wet and cold, and he walked through it with a confidence that he had not felt in years, a confidence that was born not of strength but of surrender, not of hope but of acceptance. He walked to the edge of the swamp, to the place where the false ground began and the deep water waited, and he stopped. And he waited for the creature, waited for the stripes, waited for the final entry in the ledger that would complete the pattern and unleash the hunger upon the world. Because Aaron knew, with a certainty that was beyond doubt, that his death would be the trigger, the catalyst, the final stroke that would cover the white and make the beast complete. The shepherd's death would break the deal. The witness's silence would end the warning. And the creature, freed from the constraint of the sentinel, would follow the trail of the one who got away, not to consume him. That was no longer possible. But to consume everything else, to extend its hunting grounds beyond the marsh, to reach Paxson and the towns beyond, to add stripe after stripe until the black covered the world, and the hunger was satisfied in a feast that would never end. He heard it before he saw it, the wet, heavy sound of something massive moving through the fog, the breathing that was louder now, closer, more eager. And then he saw it, the white shape emerging from the gray, the massive body coiling through the mist with a grace that was terrible and beautiful and utterly inhuman. The eyes were not blank now. They were focused, fixed on him with an intensity that was personal, intimate, a connection that had been forged 23 years ago and had been maintained through decades of watching and waiting and mutual recognition. The creature approached him, its body low to the ground, its muscles rippling beneath the white fur, and Aaron saw the stripes. He saw them clearly for the last time, saw the 4 black marks that ran down its spine, and he saw the 5th stripe that was forming, faint but visible, a smudge of darkness that was growing even as he watched, fed by the anticipation of the kill, the hunger for the shepherd, the need to complete the pattern that had been established so long ago. The creature stopped 10 feet away, its head level with Aaron's chest, its breath hot and wet and smelling of copper and old blood, and it looked at him, looked into his eyes. And Aaron looked back. He did not run. He did not fight. He did not raise his rifle or light his flares or throw his chemicals. He simply stood there, his body open, his mind empty, his spirit ready, and he accepted the role that he had been given, accepted the deal that he had made, accepted the debt that he owed to the deep, to the marsh, to the creature that was not a tiger but a ledger, not an animal but a count, not a predator but a poem written in flesh and blood and the black ink of death. The creature moved, not to strike, not to kill, but to touch. It extended its massive head, its blank eyes still fixed on Aaron's face, and it pressed its nose against his chest, a gentle, almost tender gesture that was more terrible than any attack could have been. Aaron felt the breath, the hot, wet, rattling breath that filled his lungs with the smell of the marsh, the smell of the deep, the smell of the hunger that was older than time. And he felt the stripes, felt them through the creature's fur, through the white that was becoming black, through the ledger that was almost complete. He felt the weight of the lives that had been taken, the souls that had been consumed, the entries that had been recorded in the flesh of the beast. And he felt the fifth stripe, the newest stripe, the stripe that was being formed even now, fed by his own fear, his own acceptance, his own willingness to be the final entry, the last stroke, the closing line of the poem. The creature withdrew, its head pulling back from Aaron's chest, and it looked at him one last time. And then it turned. It turned and walked away, not into the fog but along the edge of the marsh, along the boundary between the swamp and the forest, along the trail that led to Paxson, to the world, to the feast that would never end. Aaron watched it go, his body shaking, his mind empty, his heart still beating, and he understood that the creature had not killed him, had not taken him, had not added him to the ledger in the way that he had expected, because the creature did not need to kill him. The creature only needed him to stop watching, to stop warning, to stop being the shepherd. And by stepping out of the shack, by walking into the fog, by accepting the end that was not an end, Aaron had given the creature exactly what it wanted. He had surrendered. He had abdicated. He had opened the door and let the wolf into the fold. And now the wolf was walking toward the village, toward the town, toward the world of the living, and there was no one left to stand in its way. Aaron fell to his knees in the snow, his body shaking with sobs that were not of grief but of release, of the final terrible understanding that his life had been a holding action, a delay, a postponement of the inevitable, and that the inevitable had finally arrived. The creature was gone. The fog was thinning. The dawn was breaking, a pale gray dawn that offered no warmth and no hope and no indication that the world had changed. But the world had changed. The shepherd was dead. The sentinel had fallen, and the stripes would cover everything. Aaron knelt in the snow, his hands pressed against his chest where the creature had touched him, and he felt the warmth spreading, the warmth that was not the warmth of life but the warmth of the ledger, the count, the poem that was written in his flesh and that would be read by the beast when it returned, when the feast was over, when the hunger was satisfied and the white was completely covered by the black. He felt the stripe forming, not on the creature's back but on his own, a mark of darkness that was spreading through his chest, through his heart, through his soul, a stroke in the ledger that was personal and permanent and utterly inescapable. He was the fifth stripe. He was the final entry. He was the shepherd who had become the sheep, the witness who had become the victim, the sentinel who had opened the door and let the hunger into the world. And as the darkness spread, as the stripe covered his heart and his mind and his spirit, Aaron smiled. Smiled because the waiting was over. The vigilance was ended. The burden was lifted. And the poem at last was complete. The marsh took him gently, the fog closing around him like a blanket, the snow rising to meet him like a pillow, the deep water waiting beneath the false ground like a lover waiting for a kiss. Aaron sank into the white, into the lie, into the everything that had been his life and his death and his eternal, endless duty. And the creature walked on toward Paxson, toward the world, toward the feast that would never end. The stripes were 5 now. Soon they would be 6, 7, 8, 100, 1,000, until the white was completely covered and the beast was fully revealed in all its dark, terrible glory. And the world would tremble. The world would scream. The world would die, entry by entry, stroke by stroke, until the ledger was complete and the poem was finished, and the hunger that was older than the mountains and more patient than the sea was finally, irrevocably, eternally satisfied. The shepherd was gone. The sentinel had fallen. And the wolf was loose in the world, writing its poem in flesh and blood and the black ink of death, covering the white with the stripes of its hunger, consuming everything in its path with a silence that was more terrible than any roar. The white lie was over. The truth was here. And the truth was black. The truth was hungry. And the truth would never ever stop. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.